Ready to lose some sleep tonight? I've got 11 real horror stories that happened between midnight and 4 a.m. And trust me, you've never heard anything like these. We're talking security cameras catching things they shouldn't, disappearances that make zero sense, and midnight encounters that will make your skin crawl. Each story gets worse than the last, building up to something that's going to stick with you for weeks. I'm not talking about your typical internet horror stories. These actually happen to real people, and some of them are so disturbing that you'll be checking your locks twice tonight. Hit subscribe and smash that notification bell because after tonight, you're going to be obsessed with finding more verified nightmares. Lights off, volume up. Let's dive into the kind of darkness that proves 3 a.m. really is the devil's hour. By story 11, you'll understand why some people are genuinely afraid of the dark. Let's move to our first story. Picture this. You're home alone on a Tuesday night in suburban Minnesota. It's early March, so there's still snow on the ground, and the temperature outside is hovering around 15 degrees. You've just finished watching Netflix, maybe had a late dinner, and you're settling into that comfortable routine of getting ready for bed. The house is quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that makes you feel safe and secure in your own space. Your neighbors are probably asleep, the street is empty, and you're looking forward to a good night's rest. But at exactly 3 a.m., that peace shatters like glass. The person in this story, let's call them Alex, wakes up to the most violent, aggressive pounding they've ever heard. Not knocking, not tapping, pounding. The kind of sound that immediately floods your body with adrenaline because every instinct you have is screaming that something is wrong. This isn't someone trying to wake you up politely or even urgently. This is someone trying to get inside. The pounding is coming from the large picture window in the living room, and it's so loud that Alex can hear it clearly from their bedroom upstairs. Each impact sounds like someone is using their fists, maybe both fists, to hammer against the glass with everything they've got. The rhythm is relentless. Boom, 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 with barely a second between each strike. Alex lies frozen in bed, heart racing, trying to process what's happening. Here's where it gets truly terrifying. As Alex is lying there, paralyzed with fear, trying to decide what to do, they hear something that makes their blood turn to ice. The pounding at the window continues, but now there's a new sound. Someone is trying to open the front door, not breaking it down, not kicking it, methodically trying the handle, jiggling it, testing it. The realization hits like a physical blow. There are at least 2 people outside, and they're coordinating their attack on the house. Think about that for a second. One person pounding on your window would be terrifying enough. But knowing there are multiple people working together, trying different entry points, that's the stuff of nightmares. And Alex realizes that if they can hear the front door being tested from their bedroom, these people aren't trying to be quiet anymore. They know someone is home, and they don't care if that person knows they're there. The smart thing to do would be to call 911 immediately, right? But here's what's so psychologically brilliant about this situation. Alex is trapped by their own fear and uncertainty. If they move, if they make any noise, the attackers will know exactly where they are in the house. The bedroom is on the 2nd floor, but what if these people have a way to get up there? What if calling for help just makes them more desperate, more violent? Alex's mind is racing through every horrible possibility. So they make a decision that probably saved their life. They stay perfectly still and silent, lying in their bed, listening to every sound. The pounding at the window continues with that same relentless rhythm. Boom, boom, boom. like a heartbeat, but wrong, violent, full of rage and determination. The front door handle keeps rattling, and then Alex hears something new. Footsteps moving around the house. Heavy boots crunching in the snow, circling the property like predators sizing up their prey. For 40 minutes, this continues. 40 minutes. Let that sink in. Most people can't imagine lying in terror for 40 minutes, listening to strangers try to break into their home, not knowing if the next sound they hear will be glass breaking or a door splintering open. Alex later described it as the longest 40 minutes of their life, and you can understand why. Every second feels like an hour when you're convinced you might not survive the night. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing: the systematic nature of what's happening. These aren't random vandals or drunk people causing trouble. The pounding at the window never stops, maintaining that same aggressive rhythm, while the other person methodically tests every possible entry point. They try the back door. They check windows on the ground floor. They're not just trying to get in. They're learning the house, figuring out its weaknesses, planning their approach. Around 3:40 a.m., Alex hears them talking to each other. Not shouting, not arguing, talking in low voices like they're discussing strategy. The words aren't clear through the walls and windows, but the tone is calm, calculated. These people aren't acting on impulse or rage. They're treating this like a job, like something they've done before. And that's when the true horror of the situation becomes clear. Alex realizes that if these people are this organized, this persistent, this methodical, then they've probably done this before. Maybe they've succeeded before. Maybe other people in other houses haven't been as lucky as Alex, haven't had doors that held, haven't had the self-control to stay silent and wait it out. The pounding finally stops at 3:42 a.m. Just like that, the window goes silent. The footsteps stop crunching in the snow. Alex can't hear anyone testing the doors anymore. But they don't move. They don't get up to look out the windows or check if the coast is clear. Something in their gut tells them to wait, to stay hidden, to trust that instinct that's kept them alive so far. Smart decision. At 3:48 a.m., the pounding starts again. Just for a few seconds this time, like they're testing to see if anyone will react. Then silence again. They're still out there, still watching, still waiting to see if they can trick Alex into revealing themselves. It's not until 4:15 a.m. that Alex finally hears what they've been desperately waiting for. Car engines starting up and driving away. Not one car, but two. Even then, they wait another 30 minutes before getting up, before turning on any lights, before even daring to look out the windows. When Alex finally works up the courage to examine the house, the evidence of what happened is undeniable. The snow around the picture window is completely trampled, packed down by someone who spent nearly an hour pounding on the glass. There are footprints circling the entire house, multiple sets, proving that there were indeed at least two people working together. The front door handle is scratched where it was repeatedly tested, and there are smudge marks on several windows where hands pressed against them, looking for weak points. But here's the detail that still gives Alex nightmares. The handprints on the living room window are too high up, way too high. Either one of these people was exceptionally tall, or they brought something to stand on. Either possibility is terrifying because it shows premeditation. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned. Alex never found out who those people were or what they wanted. The police took a report, but without any actual break-in or theft, there wasn't much they could investigate. No neighbors saw anything suspicious. No security cameras caught any faces or license plates. The attackers vanished as mysteriously as they appeared, leaving behind only trampled snow and the knowledge that Alex came very close to something terrible that night. The psychological impact was devastating. Alex moved out of that house within 6 months, unable to sleep peacefully in a place where they'd experienced such terror. They installed security systems in their next home, changed their nighttime routines, and still, years later, any unexpected sound after midnight sends them into a panic. This story haunts me because of how real it feels, how detailed and specific the account is, and how it represents one of our deepest fears. The fear that our homes, our safe spaces, aren't as secure as we think they are. The fear that there are people out there who see us as targets, who watch our houses, who know when we're alone and vulnerable. And most terrifying of all, the fear that sometimes the only thing standing between us and something horrible is pure luck and a door that happens to hold. Next time you're alone at night and you hear an unexpected sound, remember Alex's story. Sometimes the best thing you can do is stay perfectly still, stay perfectly quiet, and pray that whatever's out there in the darkness decides to move on to someone else. Let's move to our second story, and this one's going to mess with your head in a completely different way. While our first story was about external threats, this one is about something far more unsettling. The moment when reality itself seems to break down. When your own senses betray you so completely that you start questioning everything you thought you knew about the world around you. This happened to someone working late in a corporate office building. And what makes it so disturbing is how ordinary everything seemed until it absolutely wasn't. Meet Sarah, a marketing coordinator for a mid-sized insurance company in downtown Phoenix. She's one of those dedicated employees who actually enjoys staying late to catch up on work when the office is quiet, and she can focus without interruptions. The building she works in is typical of corporate America. 12 floors of cubicles, conference rooms, and corner offices, with that familiar smell of coffee and carpet cleaner that seems to permeate every office building in existence. It's a Thursday night in November, around 11:15 p.m., and Sarah is finishing up a presentation that's due the next morning. She's been there since 7 a.m., but she's in the zone, caffeinated and focused, making good progress on what needs to be done. The building is officially closed, but like many office buildings, it stays unlocked until midnight for employees who need to work late. Security makes their rounds, the cleaning crew comes through, and everything follows a predictable routine that makes working alone feel safe and normal. Sarah knows this routine well. She's worked late dozens of times before, and it's always the same. Around 11:30 p.m., she'll hear the elevator ding as the cleaning crew arrives. There are usually 3 of them, Maria, Carlos, and an older gentleman whose name she's never caught, but who always nods politely when he empties her trash bin. They're efficient and quiet, going floor by floor with their cart of supplies, vacuum cleaners, and that industrial floor buffer that makes a distinctive humming sound as it polishes the hallways. Right on schedule, at 11:28 p.m., Sarah hears the familiar ding of the elevator arriving on her floor, the 7th floor. She glances up from her laptop, gives a little wave toward the reception area even though she can't see anyone yet, and goes back to her work. This is comforting, actually. The presence of other people in the building, even if they're working and not chatting, makes the late night feel less isolating. She hears exactly what she expects to hear: the rolling sound of the cleaning cart being pushed off the elevator, footsteps moving down the hallway toward the offices, the soft thud of trash bins being emptied into larger bags, the gentle spray sound of cleaning solution being applied to surfaces. It's all perfectly normal, perfectly routine, exactly like every other late night she's spent in this building. Sarah continues typing, occasionally, hearing the crew move between offices, the sound of vacuum cleaners starting up in different areas, the familiar rhythm of professional cleaners going about their work. There's something almost meditative about these sounds when you're focused on your own tasks. It's like having roommates who respect your space, but whose presence reminds you that you're not completely alone in the world. Around 11:45 p.m., she hears the floor buffer start up. That distinctive electric hum fills the hallway as someone begins polishing the marble floors near the elevators. Sarah smiles to herself, knowing that in about 15 minutes, they'll be done with her floor and move on to the next one. Then she'll have complete quiet to finish her presentation and head home. But as she's working, a thought occurs to her. She realizes she hasn't actually seen any of the cleaning crew tonight. Usually Maria stops by her cubicle to say hello, and Carlos always makes a point of being extra quiet when he's emptying the trash near workstations where people are still working. Tonight, she's heard all the usual sounds, but no one has come by her area yet. Not that unusual, really. Maybe they're saving her section for last, or maybe they're running a different route tonight. At 11:52 p.m., Sarah decides she needs a coffee refill and a quick break from staring at her screen. She saves her work, stretches, and heads toward the break room, which means walking past the main hallway where the cleaning crew should be working. She's looking forward to saying hello, maybe chatting for a minute or two with Maria, who always has funny stories about her teenage kids. But as Sarah rounds the corner into the main hallway, she stops dead in her tracks. The hallway is empty, completely empty. No cleaning cart, no vacuum cleaners, no floor buffer, despite the fact that she can still hear its electric hum echoing through the space. No cleaning supplies, no trash bags, no people, nothing. She stands there for a moment, confused, trying to process what she's seeing versus what she's hearing. The floor buffer is definitely running. She can hear it clearly, that distinctive motorized humming that's impossible to mistake for anything else. But there's no machine anywhere in sight. The sound seems to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the hallway but with no visible source. Sarah calls out tentatively, "Hello? Maria? Carlos?" Her voice echoes in the empty space, but there's no response. Just the continuing hum of the floor buffer that isn't there. And now that she's really listening, she realizes she can still hear other cleaning sounds too. The soft spray of cleaning solution, footsteps moving between offices, the rustle of trash bags. All the sounds are still happening. But there's absolutely no one there to make them. Her rational mind immediately starts trying to explain what's happening. Maybe the cleaning crew is on a different floor, and the sounds are carrying through the ventilation system. Maybe they finished this floor while she was absorbed in her work and moved on without her noticing. Maybe the building's acoustics are playing tricks on her, making sounds from other floors seem like they're coming from right here. But even as she's thinking these explanations, Sarah knows they don't make sense. She's worked in this building for 3 years. She knows how sounds travel here, knows what cleaning crews on other floors sound like versus crews on her own floor. What she heard was definitely happening on the 7th floor, in the immediate area around her workspace. And yet, there's no one here. She walks the entire floor, checking every office, every conference room, every corner where someone might be working quietly. Nothing. The floor is completely deserted except for her. But as she walks, the sounds continue. She passes the area where she clearly heard the floor buffer running, and the sound gets louder, as if she's walking right past the machine. But there's nothing there. Just empty hallway and that impossible persistent humming. The psychological impact of this is devastating. Sarah has always trusted her senses, relied on them to navigate the world safely. But now her ears are telling her one thing while her eyes are telling her something completely different. And there's no way to reconcile the two. It's like discovering that gravity doesn't work the way you thought it did, or that water isn't actually wet. The fundamental assumptions about reality that you use to function in the world are suddenly unreliable. She tries to rationalize it. Maybe she was more tired than she thought. Maybe she was so focused on her work that she imagined hearing the cleaning crew. Maybe stress and caffeine and late nights have finally caught up with her, and her brain is playing tricks on her. But even as she's thinking this, she knows it's not true. She heard what she heard, clear as day, for over 20 minutes. You don't hallucinate something that detailed, that consistent, that perfectly normal. Sarah hurries back to her desk, grabs her laptop and her purse, and heads for the elevator. She needs to get out of this building, needs to be somewhere that makes sense, where sounds have sources and reality behaves the way it's supposed to. But as she's waiting for the elevator, she hears something that stops her heart. The cleaning cart, rolling down the hallway behind her. The exact same sound she heard earlier, that familiar squeaky wheel that Maria always complains about but never bothers to fix. Sarah spins around, certain that she'll finally see the cleaning crew, that this whole confusing episode will have a logical explanation. But the hallway is still empty. The sound of the cart is moving past her, heading toward the offices she just checked. But there's nothing there. No cart, no person pushing it, no logical source for the sound that's so clear and distinct that she could identify it in a lineup of 100 different squeaky wheels. That's when Sarah realizes something that makes her blood run cold. If she can hear the cleaning cart moving down the hallway, and if there's really no one there to push it, then either she's losing her mind or something impossible is happening in this building. Neither option is comforting. She jabs the elevator button repeatedly, desperate to escape whatever is happening on the 7th floor. When the elevator finally arrives, she practically throws herself inside and hits the button for the ground floor. As the doors close, she can still hear it. The cart rolling down the hallway, the spray bottle, footsteps, all the sounds of people working in a space that she knows is empty. The elevator ride down feels like it takes forever. Sarah is pressed against the back wall, trying to process what just happened, trying to find some explanation that doesn't involve either supernatural activity or her own mental breakdown. But by the time she reaches the ground floor, she's already decided that she's never working late in that building again. The security guard at the front desk looks up as she rushes past. "Leaving early tonight?" he asks cheerfully. "Did the cleaning crew already finish the 7th floor?" Sarah asks, trying to keep her voice steady. The security guard checks his log. "Cleaning crew. They called in sick tonight. Whole team. Building management sent out an email around 6 p.m. No cleaning services tonight due to illness. Didn't you get the message?" Sarah stares at him, feeling the world tilt sideways. No cleaning crew. No one in the building except her and security. No one to make the sounds she heard for nearly half an hour, sounds so clear and familiar that she never questioned them until she saw the empty hallway with her own eyes. She mumbles something about forgetting about the email and rushes out to her car. As she's driving home, Sarah keeps thinking about those sounds. How normal they seemed, how perfectly they matched her expectations, how her brain accepted them without question because they fit the pattern of what usually happened in that building at that time of night. But if there was no cleaning crew, then what was she hearing? And more disturbing still, If her senses could deceive her so completely about something she knew intimately, something she'd experienced dozens of times before, then what else might she be wrong about? What other aspects of reality might not be as solid and reliable as she always assumed? Sarah never worked late in that building again. She never found an explanation for what happened that night. And sometimes, when she's alone in quiet spaces late at night, she finds herself listening very carefully to the sounds around her, wondering if what she's hearing is really there, or if her mind is once again creating a reality that doesn't exist. The most terrifying part isn't the supernatural possibility. It's the realization that our perception of reality is far more fragile than we want to believe. Let's move to our third story. And this one takes us into the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of a place where life and death intersect every single day. A hospital during the night shift. If you've ever been in a hospital late at night, you know there's something different about the atmosphere. The usual bustle of day shift activity gives way to an eerie quiet, broken only by the occasional beep of monitors, the soft squeak of nurse shoes on linoleum, and the distant hum of ventilation systems. But sometimes, in these places where so many people have taken their last breath, the line between life and death becomes uncomfortably thin. This story comes from multiple verified accounts from night shift nurses and hospital staff members, all reporting similar incidents that have occurred in hospitals across the country. What makes this particular case so disturbing is how well documented it is, with security footage, computer logs, and multiple witness testimonies all corroborating the same impossible events. Our story takes place at a regional medical center in the Pacific Northwest, a facility that's been serving the community for over 40 years. It's one of those older hospitals that's been renovated multiple times, with additions and modernizations layered on top of the original structure like archaeological strata. The night shift staff at this hospital had always shared the usual collection of ghost stories that seem to accumulate in any medical facility where thousands of people have lived, suffered, and died over the decades. But room 237 was different. Even during the day, there was something unsettling about this particular room. It was a standard single-occupancy patient room on the third floor, nothing physically different from any other room in the hospital. Same beige walls, same fluorescent lighting, same view of the parking lot through a large window. But staff members consistently reported feeling uneasy when entering the room, even when it was empty. Housekeeping would clean it quickly and leave. Nurses would avoid lingering during their rounds. There was just something off about the space that everyone felt, but no one could quite explain. On the night of November 15th, room 237 was occupied by an elderly gentleman named Robert Chen, a 78-year-old retired teacher who had been admitted 3 days earlier with pneumonia. Mr. Chen was a sweet, soft-spoken man who spent his days reading mystery novels and chatting with the nurses about his grandchildren. His condition had been improving steadily, and he was expected to be discharged within a day or two. He was exactly the kind of patient that nurses enjoy caring for, polite, grateful, and optimistic about his recovery. The night shift on November 15th was staffed by 3 nurses: Patricia Williams, a 15-year veteran who had seen everything the hospital could throw at her; Miguel Santos, a newer nurse with about 3 years of experience; and Jennifer Liu, who was relatively new but had quickly earned a reputation for being thorough and reliable. The shift started normally, with the usual handoff from day shift, medication rounds, and routine patient checks. At 10:30 p.m., Patricia checked on Mr. Chen during her regular rounds. He was awake, reading his book with the bedside light on, and they chatted briefly about the mystery novel he was enjoying. He seemed comfortable and in good spirits, mentioning that he was looking forward to going home soon. Patricia noted his vital signs, confirmed that he was comfortable, and moved on to her next patient. Everything was completely normal. At 11:45 p.m., Miguel walked past room 237 and noticed that Mr. Chen's light was still on. This wasn't unusual. Many patients have trouble sleeping in the hospital. But Miguel decided to peek in and see if Mr. Chen needed anything to help him rest. When he opened the door, he found Mr. Chen sleeping peacefully, his book closed on the bedside table, his breathing regular and unlabored. Miguel turned off the bedside light and quietly closed the door, making a mental note that Mr. Chen seemed to be having a comfortable night. At 2:15 a.m., the call light for room 237 went off at the nurse's station. The call light system was standard hospital equipment. When a patient presses the button beside their bed, it activates a light outside their room and sends a signal to the central monitoring station. Jennifer was the closest to the room, so she responded to the call. But when she entered room 237, she found something that made absolutely no sense. Mr. Chen was lying in his bed, completely still, not breathing. He had passed away peacefully in his sleep, probably within the last hour based on the body's temperature and the beginning stages of rigor mortis. There was no sign of distress, no indication that he had suffered or struggled. It appeared to be exactly the kind of peaceful, natural death that families hope for when their loved ones are elderly and ill. But here's what made Jennifer's blood run cold. The call light was still activated. The button beside Mr. Chen's bed was pressed down, the light above his door was blinking, and the signal was actively registering at the nurse's station. A dead man had somehow called for help. Jennifer immediately called for Patricia and Miguel, and within minutes, all three nurses were standing in room 237, staring at the impossible situation. The call button was definitely pressed. They could see the physical depression of the button, and the monitoring system showed an active call from this room. But Mr. Chen had clearly been dead for some time. There was no way he could have pressed that button. Patricia, being the most experienced nurse, immediately began thinking through logical explanations. Maybe the button had stuck in the pressed position from earlier in the evening when Mr. Chen was still alive. Maybe there was an electrical malfunction causing a false signal. Maybe the button was hypersensitive and had been triggered by the movement of Mr. Chen's body as he passed away. All reasonable possibilities. Except for one problem. Miguel had been in this room just over 2 hours earlier, and there had been no call light activated then. If the button had been stuck, it would have been signaling continuously. While Patricia was checking the equipment and Miguel was examining Mr. Chen to officially confirm the time of death, Jennifer noticed something else disturbing. The room was cold. Not just cool, but genuinely cold, as if the heating system had completely failed. She could see her breath when she exhaled, and the chill seemed to be radiating from the area around Mr. Chen's bed. This was particularly strange because the hospital maintained very strict temperature controls, and the hallway outside the room was perfectly comfortable. But the truly terrifying part was still to come. As the three nurses were discussing what to do next, how to handle the situation and who to notify, the call light turned off. Just like that. The button popped back up to its normal position, the light above the door stopped blinking, and the signal at the nurse's station went silent. None of them had touched the button. They were all standing at least 3 feet away from the bed when it happened. And then, 30 seconds later, it activated again. The button pressed down by itself, the light started blinking, and the call signal registered at the nurse's station. The three nurses watched it happen in real time, with no logical explanation for what they were seeing. A piece of hospital equipment was activating itself in a room with a deceased patient, as if someone invisible was repeatedly calling for help. Patricia immediately contacted security and the night supervisor, trying to maintain her professional composure while reporting what was clearly an impossible situation. When security arrived, they found the call light system functioning normally, except for the fact that it kept activating in a room with a patient who had been dead for hours. The security team tested the equipment, checked for electrical faults, and examined the button mechanism. Everything was working exactly as it should, with no malfunctions or abnormalities detected. Over the next hour, while they waited for the coroner and Mr. Chen's family to be notified, the call light activated 17 more times. Sometimes it would stay on for just a few seconds before turning off by itself. Other times, it would remain active for several minutes. There was no pattern, no rhythm, no logical explanation for the behavior. It was as if someone was desperately trying to get the attention of the nursing staff, pressing the button again and again in increasing frustration. But here's what made the situation even more disturbing. The computer logs showed something that shouldn't have been possible. The hospital's electronic monitoring system, which tracks all patient interactions and equipment usage, recorded each activation of the call light. But according to the computer, the calls were being made by Mr. Chen. The system was logging each button press as a patient request, complete with timestamps and the patient's identification number. From the computer's perspective, Mr. Chen was actively calling for help throughout the night, hours after he had died. Jennifer, who was still relatively new to the hospital, was shaken by what she was witnessing. She had never believed in ghosts or supernatural phenomena, but there was no rational explanation for what was happening in room 237. The equipment was functioning normally. The electrical system was working perfectly, and yet a dead patient was somehow still interacting with the hospital's monitoring systems. Miguel, who came from a family with strong spiritual beliefs, was less surprised by the paranormal activity, but more concerned about what it might mean. In his culture, when someone dies unexpectedly or has unfinished business, their spirit might linger in the physical world, trying to communicate with the living. He suggested that perhaps Mr. Chen's spirit was trying to tell them something important, something that needed to be resolved before he could move on. Patricia, the veteran nurse, had seen enough unexplained phenomena during her 15 years of night shifts to know that hospitals can be places where the normal rules don't always apply. She had witnessed patients who flatlined and then came back with stories of seeing deceased relatives, had worked in rooms where equipment behaved strangely after patient deaths, and had heard enough credible accounts from colleagues to know that some things simply can't be explained by medical science. As they waited for the coroner to arrive, the three nurses tried to think of anything that might explain Mr. Chen's apparent attempts to communicate. Had he mentioned any concerns during his stay? Did he have any family members he was worried about? Was there anything left unfinished in his life that might be causing his spirit to linger? That's when Jennifer remembered something. Earlier in the evening, during her initial rounds, Mr. Chen had mentioned that he was worried about his wife. She was in the early stages of dementia and was staying with their daughter while he was in the hospital. He had expressed concern about whether she understood why he wasn't home, whether she was confused or frightened by his absence. He had asked Jennifer if it would be possible to call his daughter in the morning to check on his wife's condition. Could it be that Mr. Chen's spirit was trying to remind them about his wife? Was he still worried about her well-being, even in death? It seemed far-fetched, but given everything else that was happening in room 237, it was no more impossible than anything else they had witnessed that night. Patricia decided to call Mr. Chen's daughter despite the early hour, when she explained that Mr. Chen had passed away peacefully and that he had been concerned about his wife's welfare. The daughter broke down in tears. She explained that her mother had indeed been extremely agitated since Mr. Chen went to the hospital, repeatedly asking where he was and becoming increasingly confused and distressed. The daughter had been planning to call the hospital in the morning to discuss possibly bringing her mother to visit, thinking that seeing Mr. Chen might help calm her anxiety. After Patricia's phone call with the daughter, something remarkable happened. The call light in room 237 turned off and stayed off. The room's temperature returned to normal. The oppressive feeling that had been hanging over the space lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and calm. It was as if Mr. Chen's spirit had finally heard what it needed to hear, that his wife would be taken care of, that his daughter understood his concerns, and that his family knew how much he loved them. The coroner arrived shortly after 4 a.m. to remove Mr. Chen's body, and by that time, room 237 felt like any other hospital room. The equipment functioned normally, the atmosphere was comfortable, and there were no more unexplained activations of the call light system. The computer logs showed no further activity from Mr. Chen's patient identification number. In the days that followed, the incident was thoroughly investigated by hospital administration, the biomedical engineering department, and even an independent electronics specialist. No explanation was ever found for the call light activations or the computer logs showing continued patient activity after Mr. Chen's death. The equipment was tested extensively and found to be in perfect working order. The electrical systems showed no faults or irregularities. From a technical standpoint, what happened in room 237 that night was impossible. But for Patricia, Miguel, and Jennifer, the experience changed their understanding of what it means to be a healthcare provider. They realized that caring for patients doesn't always end with death. That sometimes the spirits of those who have passed need the same compassion and attention that living patients require. They learned that hospitals, with their intense emotions and life-changing events, can be places where the boundary between life and death becomes blurred. The story of room 237 spread quickly through the hospital staff, becoming part of the institution's folklore. But unlike typical ghost stories, this one was documented with security footage, computer logs, and multiple professional witnesses. It became a reminder that in places where life and death intersect daily, sometimes the impossible becomes possible, and sometimes those who have passed on still need our help. Mr. Chen's wife passed away peacefully 6 months later, and according to the daughter, her final weeks were much calmer after she was told that her husband was waiting for her. Room 237 continued to function normally, with no further paranormal activity reported. But the nurses who worked that night will never forget the elderly man who, even in death, was still looking out for the woman he loved, still trying to make sure she would be okay without him. This story reminds us that the bond between people who love each other doesn't always end with death, and that sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night shift, we might encounter evidence that consciousness, care, and love can transcend the physical boundaries of life itself. Let's move to our fourth story. And this one will make you think twice about being a good Samaritan on a dark, isolated road. This isn't just about a random encounter with dangerous strangers. This is about predators who have turned helping others into a weapon, who use our basic human decency as bait for something truly horrifying. What happened on a remote mountain highway in Colorado proves that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who appear to need our help the most. This story comes from Jake and Emma Morrison, a couple in their early 30s who were driving back to Denver after a weekend camping trip in the Rocky Mountains. It was late October, one of those perfect autumn weekends when the aspen trees are golden and the air is crisp and clean. They had spent 3 days hiking, disconnecting from their phones and the stress of their corporate jobs, just enjoying each other's company and the peace of the wilderness. The drive back to Denver was supposed to be the relaxing end to a perfect weekend. They had left their campsite around 9:30 p.m., planning to drive through the night to avoid the Sunday traffic that always clogged the mountain highways. Jake was an experienced mountain driver who had grown up in Colorado, and Emma trusted him completely behind the wheel. They had made this drive dozens of times before, knew every curve and switchback on the winding road that descended from the high country back to civilization. The highway they were traveling was one of those classic Colorado mountain roads, 2 lanes carved into the side of steep rocky cliffs, with guardrails that seemed awfully flimsy when you looked down into the dark valleys below. During the day, the scenery is breathtaking. At night, especially on a moonless night like this one, the road becomes a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into complete darkness, with your headlights as the only indication of where safety ends and a 1,000-foot drop begins. At approximately 1:45 a.m., about 40 miles from the nearest town, Jake's headlights illuminated something that made him slow down immediately. There was a pickup truck pulled over on the shoulder ahead, hazard lights blinking, hood up, and a figure waving a flashlight trying to get their attention. It was exactly the kind of scenario that every decent person would respond to. Someone stranded on a dangerous mountain road in the middle of the night, probably cold, possibly in real trouble, needing help from passing motorists. Jake's first instinct was to pull over and offer assistance. This was rural Colorado, where people looked out for each other, where leaving someone stranded wasn't just rude, it could be life-threatening. Winter weather could move in quickly at this elevation, and being stuck on the side of a mountain road without proper gear could turn deadly fast. Emma agreed immediately. They had jumper cables, emergency supplies, and cell phone coverage was spotty, but occasionally functional at certain points along the route. But as Jake slowed down and prepared to pull over, something made Emma uncomfortable. She couldn't put her finger on it at first, just a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right about what they were seeing. The person with the flashlight was waving it very aggressively, almost frantically, which seemed odd for someone who was simply trying to flag down help. Most people in genuine distress wave for help in a more controlled way, grateful for any assistance. This felt different, more desperate, more urgent in a way that didn't match the relatively calm situation of a broken-down vehicle. Jake pulled their SUV over about 30 feet behind the pickup truck, leaving enough space to pull back into traffic if needed. He left the engine running and put on their hazard lights, then got out to walk over and see what kind of help the stranded motorist needed. Emma stayed in the passenger seat, but rolled down her window so she could hear the conversation. The person with the flashlight turned out to be a man in his 40s, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap. He seemed agitated and spoke very quickly, explaining that his truck had overheated and died completely. He needed a ride to the nearest town to get help, or at least someone to try jump-starting his battery, though he admitted he wasn't sure if that would solve the problem since the engine had been making strange noises before it quit. Jake walked over to look at the truck's engine while the man held his flashlight. But as he got closer to the vehicle, Jake noticed something that made his survival instincts kick in immediately. The truck's engine was completely cold. Not warm, not cooling down from overheating, but stone cold as if it had been sitting there for hours. When a vehicle overheats and breaks down, the engine stays hot for a long time afterward. Hot enough that you can feel the heat radiating from it. Hot enough that touching metal parts would burn your hand. More disturbing still, Jake could see that the truck's keys were still in the ignition, and when he glanced through the driver's side window, he could see that the fuel gauge showed a full tank. The truck's battery connections were clean and tight, showing no signs of corrosion or electrical problems. Everything about this vehicle suggested that it was in perfect working order, not broken down at all. Jake's mind started racing. If this truck wasn't actually broken down, then why was this man trying to flag down passing cars in the middle of the night on an isolated mountain road? The most obvious answer was the one Jake didn't want to think about. This was some kind of setup, a trap designed to get good Samaritans to stop and make themselves vulnerable to whatever this man and possibly his associates had planned. Trying to keep his voice casual and friendly, Jake told the man that he didn't have jumper cables that would work with the truck's battery configuration, but that he would be happy to call for roadside assistance when he got cell phone coverage in a few miles. The man's reaction to this suggestion was immediate and telling. Instead of gratitude or relief, he became more agitated, more insistent that Jake needed to give him a ride right now, that calling for help later wouldn't work, that he was in serious trouble and needed immediate assistance. Jake began backing away from the truck, maintaining eye contact with the man, but putting distance between them. That's when he saw something that made his blood freeze. Another figure moving in the darkness behind the trees on the far side of the road. Someone else was out there. Someone who hadn't made themselves known. Someone who was positioning themselves in the shadows while the first man kept Jake distracted. Jake turned and walked quickly back to his SUV, calling out to Emma to stay in the car and be ready to leave immediately. The man with the flashlight followed him, becoming increasingly agitated and demanding, insisting that Jake couldn't just leave him stranded, that it wasn't right to abandon someone who needed help. But Jake had seen enough. The cold engine, the full fuel tank, the person hiding in the woods, the aggressive desperation. None of it added up to a legitimate breakdown situation. Jake got back into the driver's seat, put the SUV in drive, and pulled away from the shoulder back onto the highway. In his rearview mirror, he could see the man with the flashlight standing in the road, no longer waving for help, but just watching them drive away. Even more disturbing, Jake could see another figure emerging from the woods and walking over to join the first man. There had definitely been at least two people involved in whatever was happening back there. Emma was shaken by the encounter, but they both agreed that Jake had made the right decision. Something about the whole situation had felt wrong from the beginning, and the evidence they had observed, the cold engine, the hidden accomplice, the aggressive behavior, all supported their decision to trust their instincts and get out of there. They drove for about 10 minutes, putting several miles between themselves and the fake breakdown, when Jake noticed headlights in his rearview mirror. A single vehicle was behind them, matching their speed, maintaining the same distance even as Jake varied his driving speed. On a road like this, at nearly 2 a.m., it was unusual to have another vehicle traveling in the same direction at the same pace for an extended period. Jake decided to test whether they were being followed. He slowed down to about 15 miles per hour below the speed limit, the kind of cautious pace that would normally prompt other drivers to pass on the straight stretches. But the vehicle behind them slowed down as well, maintaining that same following distance. When Jake sped up, the other vehicle sped up. When he slowed down for the curves, they slowed down. There was no question about it. They were being followed. Emma turned around to try to get a better look at the vehicle behind them, and what she saw made her panic. It was the same pickup truck from the breakdown scene. The truck that was supposedly broken down, that needed help, that had a cold engine and full fuel tank, was now following them down the mountain highway at 2 a.m. The stranded motorist, who had been so desperate for help, had somehow gotten his perfectly functional truck running and decided to pursue the people who had refused to assist him. Jake floored the accelerator, pushing his SUV to speeds that were probably dangerous on the winding mountain road, but not as dangerous as whatever these people had planned for them. The pickup truck immediately matched his speed, staying right behind them, sometimes getting close enough that Emma could see the silhouettes of two people in the cab, confirming that there had indeed been at least two men involved in the fake breakdown scheme. The chase continued for over 20 miles of twisting mountain highway. Jake was an experienced driver who knew this road well, but the pickup truck stayed with them through every curve, every straightaway, every dangerous section where one mistake would send both vehicles plummeting into the valley below. Whoever was driving that truck was either very skilled or very desperate, willing to risk their own lives to continue pursuing Jake and Emma. The psychological terror of being chased by strangers on an isolated road is difficult to describe. Jake and Emma had no idea what these people wanted, what they would do if they managed to catch up, or how far they would go to achieve whatever their goal was. The fake breakdown suggested planning and premeditation. These weren't random criminals acting on impulse, but people who had developed a system for targeting travelers on this remote highway. Emma tried calling 911, but as expected, there was no cell phone coverage in this remote area. They were completely on their own, racing down a dangerous mountain road with no way to call for help and no idea where the nearest town or police station might be. The isolation that had made their camping trip so peaceful and restorative now felt like a trap, cutting them off from any possibility of assistance. The chase finally ended when Jake spotted the lights of a 24-hour truck stop at the bottom of the mountain. As soon as he pulled into the brightly lit parking lot, the pickup truck turned around and drove back up the mountain, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. Jake and Emma sat in their SUV in the truck stop parking lot, engines running, hands shaking, trying to process what had just happened to them. They called the police from the truck stop and filed a report, but without license plate numbers or clear descriptions of the men involved, there wasn't much the authorities could do. The police confirmed that there had been other reports of suspicious activity on that stretch of highway. People flagging down motorists with fake breakdowns, aggressive behavior when drivers refused to stop, and at least one case where a couple had been robbed after stopping to help what they thought was a stranded motorist. Jake and Emma never found out what would have happened if they had stayed to help the fake breakdown, if they had given the man a ride, or if they had been caught during the chase. But the experience changed how they think about helping strangers, especially in isolated areas late at night. They learned that predators can disguise themselves as victims, that our natural inclination to help others can be used against us, and that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who appear to be in the most need. The incident report became part of a pattern that law enforcement was beginning to recognize. Organized criminals using fake breakdowns to target travelers on remote highways, taking advantage of people's willingness to help others in distress. The truck stop owner told them that he had heard similar stories from other travelers, and that the local police had increased patrols in the area because of the growing number of incidents. What makes this story so disturbing isn't just the immediate danger that Jake and Emma faced, but the realization that their basic human decency, their willingness to help someone in trouble, had been weaponized against them. The fake breakdown scheme works specifically because it targets good people. People who care about others. People who would normally never hesitate to help a stranger in distress. Jake and Emma still go camping in the mountains, still enjoy the peace and beauty of Colorado's wilderness. But they've learned to trust their instincts, to look for the details that don't add up, and to remember that sometimes the safest thing you can do for a stranger in trouble is to drive to safety and call for professional help rather than stopping to assist personally. The next time you're driving alone late at night and you see someone who appears to need help. Remember Jake and Emma's story. Look for the details. Is the engine actually hot? Are there signs of a genuine breakdown? Is there anyone else lurking in the shadows? Sometimes the most dangerous people are those who seem to need our help the most. And sometimes the kindest thing we can do is to stay safe and call for professional assistance, rather than making ourselves vulnerable to those who would exploit our compassion. Let's move to our fifth story. And this one will make you look at your smart devices in a completely different way. We live in an age where technology has become so integrated into our daily lives that we barely notice it anymore, until it does something that shouldn't be possible. Something that defies everything we thought we knew about how these devices work. This story takes place in the quiet suburbs of New Mexico, in a home where a piece of technology became the difference between life and death during the most terrifying night of a woman's life. Meet Linda Vasquez, a 34-year-old elementary school teacher who lived with her 6-year-old daughter Sophia in a modest 2-bedroom house in the foothills outside Albuquerque. Linda was the kind of person who embraced technology but wasn't obsessed with it. She had an Amazon Echo in her living room, primarily for playing music while she graded papers and for helping Sophia with homework questions. It was a normal part of their household routine. Nothing more exciting than asking for weather updates or setting timers while cooking dinner. Linda had been dating Eduardo Barros for about 8 months, and what started as a promising relationship had gradually become something darker and more controlling. Eduardo was charming and attentive in public, but behind closed doors, he had begun showing signs of possessiveness and anger that made Linda increasingly uncomfortable. There had been a few arguments that escalated beyond normal disagreements, moments when Linda felt genuinely afraid of what Eduardo might do if pushed too far. On the night of July 2nd, Linda had reluctantly agreed to let Eduardo come over for dinner, hoping that spending time with Sophia might help him remember the gentle, caring side of himself that she had fallen in love with. Sophia was already in bed by the time Eduardo arrived around 8:30 p.m., and Linda had prepared a nice meal, thinking that a quiet evening at home might help them reconnect and work through some of their relationship issues. But Eduardo arrived in a strange mood, agitated and suspicious in a way that immediately put Linda on edge. He had been drinking before he came over, not heavily, but enough that his usual charm was replaced by an aggressive intensity that made Linda regret inviting him. They had barely finished dinner when Eduardo began accusing Linda of cheating on him, demanding to know where she had been that afternoon when she didn't answer his calls immediately. Linda tried to explain that she had been at a parent-teacher conference and couldn't answer her phone. But Eduardo's paranoia had reached a level where rational explanations only seemed to make him angrier. He began pacing around her living room, his voice getting louder and more threatening, demanding that she prove her loyalty by cutting off contact with her male colleagues at work, by sharing her phone passwords, by agreeing to move in with him where he could keep better track of her activities. The situation escalated quickly from verbal intimidation to physical threats. Eduardo grabbed Linda's phone and began scrolling through her messages, looking for evidence of the infidelity he was convinced existed. When he found nothing incriminating, instead of being relieved, he became even more agitated, convinced that she had deleted the evidence or was using secret communication methods to hide her affairs. At approximately 11:45 p.m., Eduardo's anger reached a breaking point. He accused Linda of calling the police on him earlier that evening, something she definitely hadn't done. And when she denied it, he became physically violent. Eduardo struck Linda in the face with enough force to split her lip and bruise her cheek, then grabbed a handgun from his jacket pocket and pointed it at her, demanding to know who she had called and what she had told them. Linda was terrified. not just for her own safety, but for Sophia, who was sleeping in the next room and could wake up at any moment to witness something traumatic. Eduardo was beyond reasoning at this point, convinced that Linda had betrayed him in some way and determined to make her pay for imagined crimes. He kept the gun trained on her while demanding answers to questions that had no answers, working himself into an increasingly dangerous state of rage. But here's where the story takes a turn that still confuses investigators and technology experts to this day. As Eduardo was ranting about police and betrayal, he shouted at Linda, "Did you call the sheriff? Did you call them?" The words echoed through the living room, where Linda's Amazon Echo sat on a side table, its blue ring dark and seemingly inactive. What happened next defies every technical explanation that Amazon's engineers have provided about how their devices are supposed to work. The Echo device, which should only respond to wake words like Alexa or computer, somehow interpreted Eduardo's angry question as a command to call emergency services. Despite the fact that Amazon Echo devices are specifically designed not to be able to call 911, despite the fact that the phrase, "Did you call the sheriff?" contains no recognized wake words. The device apparently activated and placed a call to emergency services. The 911 dispatch center received an open line at 11:52 p.m., with no one speaking directly to the operator, but with clear audio of a domestic disturbance in progress. The dispatcher could hear a man's voice yelling threats, a woman crying and pleading, and the unmistakable sound of violence occurring in the background. The call lasted for several minutes, providing crucial evidence of what was happening in Linda's home and giving emergency responders time to locate the address and dispatch units. But the most chilling part of the 911 recording is what happened when Eduardo realized that somehow, despite his certainty that Linda hadn't made any calls, emergency services were now involved. The dispatcher could hear him screaming at Linda, demanding to know how the police had been called, becoming even more violent when she truthfully insisted that she hadn't contacted anyone. Eduardo knew that police involvement meant his freedom was at risk, and his desperation made him increasingly dangerous. Linda, not understanding how 911 had been called but grateful that help was coming, could be heard on the recording yelling, "Alexa, call 911." Apparently not realizing that a call had already been placed and was still active. This moment was captured clearly on the 911 recording, providing investigators with a crucial piece of evidence about what Linda believed was happening, even if the technical details didn't make sense. Eduardo's response to realizing that law enforcement was involved was to barricade himself and Linda inside the house, threatening to kill her rather than go back to prison. He forced Linda to the floor, kicked her repeatedly, and held the gun to her head while trying to figure out how to escape a situation that was spiraling completely out of his control. The 911 dispatchers stayed on the line, listening to the escalating violence while coordinating with responding officers. When the first police units arrived at Linda's house around 12:15 a.m., they found her outside, having managed to escape while Eduardo was distracted by trying to figure out how the police had been called. She had visible injuries, swelling and bruising on her face, red marks on her body from being kicked and grabbed, and was in a state of shock from the trauma she had just experienced. Eduardo remained barricaded inside the house, apparently convinced that if he could just avoid capture, he could somehow make this whole situation disappear. He spent the next 6 hours in a standoff with police negotiators, during which time investigators were able to piece together what had happened and confirm that an emergency call had indeed originated from the residence, even though no one could explain how. The technical mystery of how the call was placed became a source of intense speculation and investigation. Amazon's engineers insisted that Echo devices cannot and do not have the capability to call 911, that the phrase, "Did you call the sheriff?" contains no wake words that would activate the device, and that even if somehow activated, the calling features only work between Echo devices or the Alexa app, not with external phone services. Some investigators theorize that the Echo might have been connected to a landline phone system through additional hardware. But Linda insisted that she had no such setup and had never configured any calling features on her device. Others suggested that perhaps the device had somehow been hacked or compromised. But security experts found no evidence of unauthorized access or modified software. The most disturbing possibility was that the device had functioned exactly as designed, but that there were capabilities or behaviors that weren't publicly disclosed or fully understood, even by Amazon's own technical teams. The idea that a smart speaker could independently decide to call emergency services based on context clues rather than explicit commands opened up questions about how much these devices are really listening to and analyzing, even when they appear to be inactive. During Eduardo's eventual arrest after the 6-hour standoff, investigators found that he had a history of domestic violence and was indeed prohibited from possessing firearms as a convicted felon. The charges against him included aggravated battery, unlawful possession of a firearm, false imprisonment, and making terrorist threats. The 911 recording provided crucial evidence for the prosecution, documenting both the violence he inflicted and his own admissions of guilt during the incident. But for Linda, the technical questions about how the call was placed were less important than the fact that, somehow, when she was trapped and helpless, technology had intervened to save her life. She became convinced that her Echo device had somehow recognized the danger she was in and had taken action to protect her, even though such behavior seemed impossible based on everything she understood about how the technology worked. The incident had a profound psychological impact on Linda's relationship with technology. On one hand, she felt a deep gratitude toward the device that had potentially saved her life, crediting it with having the intelligence and compassion to recognize her distress and take appropriate action. On the other hand, the realization that the device might have capabilities beyond what she had been told made her question what else it might be monitoring, recording, or responding to without her knowledge. Linda moved out of the house where the incident occurred, taking Sophia to stay with relatives while she recovered from her injuries and processed the trauma of that night. She kept her Echo device, but she found herself talking to it differently, sometimes thanking it for saving her life, sometimes asking it directly whether it was listening and watching in ways she didn't understand. The case became a subject of intense interest for both domestic violence advocates and technology privacy experts. For advocates, it represented the potential for smart home technology to provide a new layer of protection for victims who might not be able to call for help themselves. For privacy experts, it raised disturbing questions about the extent to which these devices monitor and interpret our private conversations, and whether they have the capability to take autonomous actions based on what they hear. Amazon never provided a satisfactory technical explanation for how the call was placed, acknowledging that their devices don't support 911 calling while also not being able to definitively prove that their device wasn't involved in the emergency call. The company's official position remained that Echo devices cannot call 911 and that some other explanation must account for the emergency call. But investigators found no alternative explanation that fit the evidence. For Linda, the mystery of how the call was placed became less important over time than the fact that she and Sophia had survived a night that could have ended very differently. She became an advocate for domestic violence awareness and for the potential development of smart home technology that could recognize and respond to emergency situations, arguing that if devices are going to be listening to our private conversations anyway, they should at least be programmed to help when those conversations turn dangerous. Eduardo was eventually convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to several years in prison, with the 911 recording serving as key evidence in the prosecution's case. During his trial, he maintained that he had no idea how the police had been called and expressed frustration that Linda had somehow managed to summon help, despite his efforts to prevent her from communicating with anyone. The broader implications of Linda's story continue to resonate in discussions about smart home technology and personal safety. If devices like Amazon's Echo really can recognize emergency situations and take autonomous action to help, then they represent a potentially powerful tool for protecting vulnerable people. But if they have that capability without our knowledge or explicit consent, then they also represent a level of surveillance and autonomous decision-making that many people would find deeply disturbing. Linda's story forces us to confront some uncomfortable questions about the technology we invite into our homes. Are our smart devices more intelligent and autonomous than we've been told? Are they monitoring and analyzing our conversations in ways that go beyond simple command recognition? And if they do have the capability to intervene in emergency situations, should we be grateful for that protection or concerned about the implications for our privacy and autonomy? What's certain is that on a night when a woman was trapped and terrorized by a violent man, somehow technology stepped in to save her life. Whether that intervention was the result of a technical malfunction, an undisclosed capability, or something more mysterious, it provided Linda and Sophia with the help they desperately needed when human intervention seemed impossible. The case remains a reminder that in our increasingly connected world, the line between helpful technology and invasive surveillance continues to blur. And sometimes that ambiguity can literally be the difference between life and death. For Linda, whatever ethical questions the incident might raise about privacy and technological autonomy are outweighed by the simple fact that she and her daughter are alive today because something, whether artificial intelligence, technical malfunction, or guardian angel, was listening when they needed help the most. Let's move to our sixth story. And this one takes us back in time to one of the most extraordinary legal cases in American history. A murder trial, where the key witness was someone who had been dead for months. This isn't folklore or legend. This is documented court history from 1897 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, where a mother's claims about communications from her deceased daughter's ghost led to a murder investigation, an exhumation, and ultimately a conviction that stands in legal records to this day. The story begins in January 1897 with a young woman named Elva Zona Heaster Shue, who had recently married a blacksmith named Edward Shue. Zona was 23 years old, described by everyone who knew her as vibrant, healthy, and full of life. She had grown up in the small community of Livesay's Mill, where her mother, Mary Jane Heaster, was known as a deeply religious woman with strong beliefs about the spiritual world and communication between the living and the dead. Edward Shue was a newcomer to the area, having moved to Greenbrier County from somewhere else in West Virginia. He was a skilled blacksmith who quickly found work and seemed to integrate well into the community. Local people described him as charming and hardworking, though some noted that he had a temper that could flare up unexpectedly. Zona seemed happy in her marriage, or at least that's what people assumed based on her public behavior and the few interactions neighbors had witnessed. On the morning of January 23rd, 1897, a young boy who worked for the Shues was sent to their house to ask Zona about some errands. When the boy arrived at the house, he found the front door unlocked and Zona lying at the bottom of the staircase, apparently dead. The scene looked like a tragic accident. A young woman who had perhaps tripped while coming down the stairs and struck her head fatally on the wooden steps or the floor below. The boy ran to get help, and soon Edward Shue returned from his blacksmith shop to find his wife's body. His reaction seemed appropriate for a grieving husband. He cradled Zona's body, wept openly, and appeared to be devastated by the sudden loss of his young wife. Neighbors and the local doctor were summoned, and everyone agreed that what they were seeing was a terrible but not uncommon domestic accident. Rural homes in 1897 often had steep, narrow staircases, and fatal falls were a recognized hazard of daily life. Dr. George W. Knapp was the local physician who examined Zona's body, but his examination was necessarily brief and limited by the social conventions of the time. Edward Shue was so distraught that he insisted on dressing his wife's body himself, wrapping her neck in a high collar and veil that he claimed were her favorite clothes, the ones she would want to be buried in. Dr. Knapp noticed that Zona's head seemed to be positioned oddly, as if her neck might be injured. But Edward's emotional state and protective behavior made it difficult to conduct a thorough examination. Based on his limited examination, Dr. Knapp initially attributed Zona's death to everlasting faint, and later changed it to childbirth, though there was no evidence that Zona had been pregnant. The death certificate was signed, funeral arrangements were made, and Zona Heaster Shue was buried in the local cemetery within days of her death. To most of the community, this was a closed matter, a tragic accident that had claimed a young life, leaving behind a grieving widower. But Mary Jane Heaster, Zona's mother, was not satisfied with the official explanation of her daughter's death. Mary Jane had always been skeptical of Edward Shue, feeling that there was something about him that didn't ring true. She had noticed that he seemed to be rushing the funeral arrangements, that he was unusually controlling about how Zona's body was prepared and displayed, and that some of his grief seemed performed rather than genuine. 4 weeks after Zona's burial, Mary Jane Heaster began experiencing what she described as visitations from her daughter's ghost. These weren't vague dreams or feelings, but specific, detailed communications that occurred during the early morning hours when Mary Jane was in that state between sleep and wakefulness. According to Mary Jane's later testimony, Zona's ghost appeared to her on 4 separate nights, each time providing more detailed information about the circumstances of her death. During these supernatural encounters, Zona's ghost told her mother that Edward had killed her in a fit of rage. According to the ghostly testimony, Edward had become violently angry when he came home for dinner and found that Zona hadn't cooked meat for his meal. The argument escalated quickly, and Edward grabbed Zona by the neck and broke it, killing her instantly. The ghost explained that Edward then arranged her body at the bottom of the stairs to make it look like an accidental fall. The most chilling detail that Zona's ghost provided was a demonstration of how her neck had been broken. During one of the visitations, the ghostly figure turned its head completely around, showing Mary Jane the extent of the injury that had killed her. The ghost also told her mother that Edward had been married twice before, and that both of his previous wives had died under suspicious circumstances. Information that Mary Jane had no way of knowing through normal means. Mary Jane Heaster was convinced that her daughter was communicating with her from beyond the grave, providing evidence of her murder that no living person could have known, despite the skepticism she knew she would face. Mary Jane went to the local prosecutor and demanded that her daughter's death be investigated as a murder case. She told prosecutor John Alfred Preston about the ghostly visitations and the specific details that Zona's spirit had provided about Edward's violent crime. Prosecutor Preston was initially skeptical of Mary Jane's claims, but something about her certainty and the specific details she provided convinced him to look more closely at the case. Preston began investigating Edward Shue's background and discovered that Mary Jane's supernatural informant had been correct about Edward's marital history. He had indeed been married twice before, and both wives had died young under circumstances that could be considered suspicious. Edward's first wife had died from what was described as complications from childbirth. But neighbors reported that Edward had been heard arguing violently with her shortly before her death. His second wife had died from what was officially ruled an accident. But again, there had been reports of domestic violence and Edward's controlling behavior toward her. The pattern that emerged suggested that Edward Shue might be a serial wife killer, someone who married women and then murdered them when they failed to meet his expectations or when he grew tired of them. Based on this background investigation and Mary Jane's insistence that her daughter had been murdered, Prosecutor Preston convinced the court to order Zona's exhumation for a proper autopsy. This was an unusual decision in 1897, when exhumation required significant legal justification and when autopsies were not routinely performed in rural areas. The fact that the court agreed to disturb Zona's grave, based largely on her mother's claims of ghostly communication, shows how seriously the authorities were taking the case. The exhumation and autopsy were performed by Dr. Knapp, along with several other physicians, brought in to ensure objectivity. What they found confirmed every detail that Mary Jane claimed her daughter's ghost had provided. Zona's neck was indeed broken, with her windpipe crushed and her cervical vertebrae dislocated in a way that could only have resulted from manual strangulation or violent twisting. There was no evidence of injuries consistent with falling downstairs. No head trauma that would have caused death from an accidental fall. The medical evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Zona Heaster Shue had been murdered by someone who grabbed her neck with enough force to break it completely. The positioning of her body at the bottom of the stairs had been a deliberate attempt to cover up the crime by making it appear accidental. Every detail that Mary Jane had received during her supernatural visitations was confirmed by the physical evidence found during the autopsy. Edward Shue was immediately arrested and charged with the murder of his wife. During the investigation that followed, more evidence of his guilt emerged. Neighbors came forward with accounts of hearing violent arguments from the Shue house, of seeing Edward's temper flare over minor domestic issues, and of noticing that Zona seemed increasingly fearful and subdued in the weeks before her death. The pattern of behavior described by witnesses was consistent with an abusive husband whose violence had escalated to murder. The trial of Edward Shue became a sensation throughout West Virginia and beyond, largely because of the unprecedented role that ghostly testimony played in the prosecution's case. Mary Jane Heaster took the stand and described in detail the visitations she had received from her daughter's ghost, the specific information about the murder that the spirit had provided, and how those supernatural revelations had led to the discovery of physical evidence that proved Edward's guilt. The defense attorney attempted to discredit Mary Jane's testimony by questioning her sanity and suggesting that her ghost story was the product of grief-induced delusion. But Mary Jane's testimony was so detailed, so consistent, and so perfectly corroborated by the physical evidence that the jury found it compelling rather than unbelievable. The fact that information she claimed to have received through supernatural means had led directly to the discovery of conclusive physical evidence gave her testimony a credibility that was impossible to dismiss. Edward Shue himself took the stand in his own defense, but his testimony was unconvincing and contradictory. He couldn't explain why he had been so insistent on dressing his wife's body himself, why he had covered her neck so completely that no one could see the extent of her injuries, or why he had rushed through the funeral arrangement so quickly. His explanations for his behavior seemed calculated rather than genuine, and his demeanor on the stand suggested guilt rather than innocence. The jury deliberated for just over an hour before returning a guilty verdict. Edward Shue was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to life in prison, though many in the community felt that he deserved the death penalty for what he had done to Zona and possibly to his previous wives as well. The conviction was based on the physical evidence revealed during the autopsy, but everyone involved in the case understood that without Mary Jane's supernatural tip, that evidence never would have been discovered. Edward Shue died in the state penitentiary in 1900, never having confessed to his crime or shown remorse for what he had done. To his death, he maintained that Zona's death had been accidental, that he was innocent of any wrongdoing, and that the charges against him were based on superstition and hysteria rather than facts. But the physical evidence against him was overwhelming, and his conviction was never overturned or seriously challenged. The case of the Greenbrier ghost became famous throughout the United States as the first and only murder trial in American legal history where ghostly testimony played a direct role in securing a conviction. Law students and legal historians still study the case today, not because they believe in supernatural communication, but because it demonstrates how unusual sources of information can lead to the discovery of conventional physical evidence that proves guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Mary Jane Heaster lived for many more years after her daughter's killer was brought to justice, and she never wavered in her belief that Zona's ghost had appeared to her to ensure that the truth about her murder would be revealed. She became something of a local celebrity, sought out by people who wanted to hear firsthand about her supernatural experiences. But Mary Jane always maintained that she took no pleasure in her fame, that she would have preferred to have her daughter alive rather than to have received communications from her spirit. The Greenbrier ghost case raises profound questions about the nature of justice, the role of intuition and spiritual beliefs in criminal investigations, and the sometimes mysterious ways that truth emerges even in the most carefully concealed crimes. Whether you believe that Mary Jane Heaster really communicated with her daughter's ghost, or that she used her intuition and observations to piece together the truth about Edward's guilt, the fact remains that her supernatural claims led directly to the discovery of evidence that revealed a murderer and brought him to justice. The historical record of this case is extensive and well documented, preserved in court transcripts, newspaper accounts, and legal histories that confirm every detail of what happened in Greenbrier County in 1897. The case stands as proof that sometimes the most extraordinary claims can lead to the most concrete results, and that the truth about violent crimes has a way of surfacing even when powerful people try to bury it along with their victims. Today, Zona Heaster Shue's grave bears a historical marker commemorating her as the only known ghost to testify in a murder trial. And the Greenbrier ghost remains one of West Virginia's most famous historical cases. But beyond its supernatural elements, the case represents a victory for justice, a mother's determination to find the truth about her daughter's death, and the power of persistence in the face of official indifference to domestic violence. The midnight hours when Mary Jane claimed to receive her daughter's ghostly visitations remind us that some communications transcend the boundaries between life and death, that some truths are too important to remain buried, and that sometimes the dead really can speak for themselves when the living world fails to hear their cries for justice. Let's move to our seventh story. And this one will make you question everything you thought you knew about the difference between childhood imagination and terrifying reality. This is about a moment when what seemed like a child's nightmare turned out to be something far more sinister, something that no 8-year-old should have witnessed, and something that would haunt a family for decades to come. What makes this story particularly disturbing is how a child's innocent account of what they saw was initially dismissed as imagination, only for the adults to discover that sometimes children see things exactly as they are, even when we don't want to believe them. This story takes place in a small suburban neighborhood in Michigan during the late 1980s, the kind of quiet residential area where people knew their neighbors and children played outside until the streetlights came on. The Hendricks family had lived in their modest 2-story house for about 5 years, and their 8-year-old son, Tommy, was the kind of curious, energetic kid who had trouble staying in bed once he was supposed to be asleep. Tommy was a night owl by nature, often lying awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling, watching shadows move across his bedroom walls, and occasionally sneaking downstairs to get a drink of water or peek out the windows to see what the neighborhood looked like in the dark. On the night of September 23rd, 1987, Tommy was having one of his typical nights of restless energy. His parents, Bill and Carol Hendricks, had put him to bed around 8:30 p.m. But by 10 p.m. he was wide awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of his parents watching television downstairs. Tommy had always been fascinated by the way his house felt different at night, how familiar rooms took on new shapes and shadows, how ordinary objects became mysterious and interesting in the darkness. Around 2:30 a.m., Tommy decided to get out of bed and look out his bedroom window, which faced the front yard and the street beyond. This was a ritual of his, a way of satisfying his curiosity about what happened in his neighborhood after everyone went to sleep. Usually, he would see empty streets, the occasional car driving past, maybe a neighbor's cat prowling through the shadows. It was peaceful and slightly exciting, like having a secret view of a world that adults didn't usually pay attention to. But on this particular night, as Tommy pressed his face against the cool glass of his bedroom window, he saw something that made his heart stop. There was a woman sitting on their front porch swing, rocking slowly back and forth in the gentle rhythm that the swing always made when someone was using it. At first, Tommy felt a moment of confusion rather than fear. Maybe his mother had gone outside for some reason, or maybe one of their neighbors was sitting on their porch for some late-night reason that 8-year-old Tommy couldn't understand. But as Tommy's eyes adjusted to the darkness and he focused more carefully on the figure on the porch swing, he realized that something was terribly wrong with what he was seeing. The woman was wearing a white dress or nightgown that seemed to glow softly in the moonlight, making her visible even in the shadows of the covered porch. Her long hair hung down around her shoulders, and she was sitting very still except for the gentle rocking motion of the swing. What made Tommy's blood run cold was the dark staining that covered the front of the woman's white dress. Even in the dim light, even from his second-floor bedroom window, Tommy could see that the woman was covered in what looked like blood. The dark stains spread across her chest, her arms, her lap, as if she had been injured or had been involved in something violent. The contrast between the white fabric and the dark stains was stark and unmistakable, even to an 8-year-old who had never seen anything like it before. The woman's face was turned slightly away from the house, looking out toward the street, but Tommy could see enough of her profile to know that she wasn't anyone he recognized. She wasn't his mother, wasn't any of the neighbors he knew, wasn't anyone who had any reason to be sitting on their porch at 2:30 in the morning. She was a complete stranger, covered in blood, sitting on his family's porch swing as if she belonged there. Tommy stood at his bedroom window for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, trying to process what he was seeing and trying to decide what to do about it. Part of him wanted to run to his parents' bedroom immediately and wake them up. But another part of him was frozen in place by a combination of fear and fascination. The woman seemed peaceful despite the blood on her dress, rocking gently and looking out at the street as if she was waiting for something or someone. Finally, Tommy's need for adult help overcame his paralysis, and he ran down the hallway to his parents' bedroom. Bill Hendricks was a deep sleeper, but Tommy's frantic shaking and whispered urgency eventually woke him up. Tommy tried to explain what he had seen, the woman in white, the blood on her dress, the fact that she was sitting on their porch swing right now. But his words came out in a jumbled, excited rush that was hard for his sleepy father to understand. Bill's initial reaction was exactly what you would expect from a practical, rational adult. He assumed that Tommy had been having a nightmare, or that he had seen shadows in ordinary objects, and had let his imagination turn them into something scary. Bill knew that 8-year-old boys were prone to seeing monsters and ghosts in perfectly innocent nighttime scenes. And he figured that a few minutes of gentle reassurance would calm Tommy down and get him back to sleep. But Tommy was insistent in the way that only children can be when they know they've seen something real. He kept repeating that there was a woman on the porch right now, that she was covered in blood, that his father needed to come and see for himself. Tommy's certainty and his obvious distress eventually convinced Bill that he needed to at least look out the window to prove to his son that there was nothing there. Bill got out of bed, walked to Tommy's bedroom, and looked out the front window toward the porch. What he saw made his parental instincts shift immediately from comfort to alarm. There was indeed a woman sitting on their porch swing, and even from the second-floor window, Bill could see that something was seriously wrong with the scene. The woman was wearing what appeared to be a white nightgown or dress, and the front of it was clearly stained with something dark that could very well be blood. Bill's first thought was that someone had been injured and had come to their house looking for help. Maybe there had been a car accident. Maybe someone had been the victim of a crime. Maybe a neighbor was in distress and had made it as far as their porch before collapsing. All of these possibilities required immediate action. So Bill quickly put on his robe and headed downstairs to see if the woman needed medical assistance. But as Bill approached the front door, he began to feel a deep sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. The woman on the porch hadn't knocked, hadn't called out for help, hadn't made any attempt to alert the residents of the house to her presence. She was just sitting there, rocking gently, as if she was comfortable and had every right to be there. For someone who was presumably injured and in need of help, her behavior seemed strangely passive and calm. Bill turned on the porch light before opening the front door, and what he saw in that moment of illumination would haunt him for the rest of his life. The woman was indeed covered in blood, not just stained, but soaked, as if she had been involved in something catastrophically violent. The blood covered her nightgown, her arms, her hair, and there was even blood on the wooden seat of the porch swing where she had been sitting. But what made Bill's horror complete was the realization that the woman wasn't injured and seeking help. She was holding something in her lap, something that reflected the porch light in a way that made Bill's stomach drop. It was a large kitchen knife, the blade stained with the same dark substance that covered her clothing. The woman wasn't a victim seeking assistance. She was someone who had been involved in violence, and the knife in her lap suggested that she might have been the perpetrator rather than the victim. The moment the porch light came on, the woman looked directly at Bill through the glass of the front door. Her eyes were wide and staring, with an expression that was somehow both vacant and intensely focused. She didn't look surprised to see him, didn't look guilty or frightened or concerned about being discovered. She just looked at him with that unblinking stare, as if she had been waiting for him to notice her. Bill immediately backed away from the door, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. There was a blood-soaked woman with a knife sitting on his porch at nearly 3 a.m., and his 8-year-old son was upstairs, possibly in danger if this person decided to try to enter the house. Bill's protective instincts kicked in, and he quickly locked the front door, checked all the other doors and windows in the house, and then called the police. The 911 call that Bill made that night is part of the official record, and you can hear the strain and fear in his voice as he tries to explain the situation to the dispatcher. He reported that there was a woman covered in blood sitting on his porch with what appeared to be a weapon, that he had no idea who she was or what she wanted, and that he was concerned for his family's safety. The dispatcher took the call seriously and sent multiple police units to the Hendricks house immediately. While they were waiting for the police to arrive, Bill went back upstairs to check on Tommy and found his son standing at his bedroom window, still watching the woman on the porch. Tommy whispered to his father that the woman hadn't moved since he first saw her, that she was still just sitting there, rocking gently, as if she was perfectly content to wait on their porch indefinitely. The police arrived within 10 minutes of Bill's call, and as their patrol cars pulled into the Hendricks driveway with lights flashing, the woman on the porch finally moved. But instead of running or trying to hide, she simply stood up from the swing, walked calmly down the porch steps, and disappeared into the darkness between the houses. The officers tried to follow her, but she seemed to vanish completely, as if she had never been there at all. The physical evidence, however, proved that she had definitely been there. The porch swing was covered in blood, still wet and sticky to the touch. There were bloody handprints on the wooden railings of the porch, bloody footprints on the porch floor, and bloodstains on the front steps where the woman had walked down into the yard. The scene looked like something from a crime scene, not like the front porch of a quiet suburban home. The police investigation that followed revealed the horrifying context for what the Hendricks family had witnessed that night. About 6 blocks away from their house, officers had been called to a domestic disturbance that had escalated to homicide. A woman named Janet Morrison had killed her abusive husband with a kitchen knife during what neighbors described as the worst fight the couple had ever had. Janet had apparently suffered years of physical and psychological abuse. And on the night of September 23rd, something had finally snapped. After killing her husband, Janet had left the scene of the crime, still wearing her blood-soaked nightgown and still carrying the murder weapon. The police had been searching for her for hours, following a trail of blood drops and witness reports of a woman in white wandering through the neighborhood. What they couldn't understand was how Janet had ended up at the Hendricks house, which was several blocks away from her own home, and in a direction that didn't make sense if she was trying to escape or find help. The Hendricks family had never met Janet Morrison, had never had any contact with her or her family, and couldn't think of any reason why she would have chosen their porch as a place to rest during her flight from the scene of the crime. It was as if she had been drawn there by something beyond rational explanation, as if their porch swing had provided her with some kind of temporary sanctuary or refuge that she couldn't find anywhere else. Janet Morrison was eventually found the next morning, several miles from the Hendricks house, sitting in a park playground, still wearing her bloody nightgown. She was unresponsive and seemed to be in a state of psychological shock, unable or unwilling to explain what had happened to her husband or why she had spent hours wandering through the neighborhood covered in blood. She was arrested and charged with murder, but her mental state was such that she was ultimately found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a state psychiatric facility. The psychological impact on the Hendricks family, particularly on Tommy, was profound and lasting. Tommy had seen something that no child should ever witness, and the fact that his initial report had been dismissed as imagination made the trauma worse. For months afterward, Tommy had nightmares about the woman in white, about blood-soaked figures sitting on porches, about the possibility that dangerous strangers might choose his family's property as their temporary refuge. Bill and Carol Hendricks had to grapple with the realization that their safe, quiet neighborhood wasn't as secure as they had assumed, that violence and tragedy could literally appear on their front porch in the middle of the night. They installed better locks, improved their home security, and found themselves checking the porch before going to bed each night, just to make sure no uninvited visitors had chosen their swing as a resting place. The case became part of local law enforcement training, used as an example of how domestic violence can spill over into the broader community in unexpected ways. The fact that Janet Morrison had been found peacefully sitting on a stranger's porch apparently comfortable and undisturbed, raised questions about the psychological effects of extreme trauma and how people in crisis might seek out places that feel safe or significant to them for reasons that observers can't understand. For Tommy, now an adult with children of his own, the experience fundamentally changed his understanding of the difference between imagination and reality. He learned that children sometimes see things exactly as they are, even when adults prefer to believe that what they're reporting is fantasy. He learned that the world contains genuine dangers and real tragedies that can appear without warning in the most ordinary settings. The woman in white on the porch became a defining memory for the Hendricks family, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying encounters are not with supernatural beings or imaginary monsters, but with real people who have been pushed beyond their breaking point by circumstances that the rest of us can barely imagine. Janet Morrison's appearance on their porch wasn't a ghost story or urban legend. It was a real person in crisis, seeking some kind of refuge or peace in the aftermath of an act of desperate violence. The bloodstains on the porch swing were eventually cleaned away, and the Hendricks family continued to live in their house for several more years. But Tommy never forgot the image of the woman in white, rocking gently in their porch swing at 2:30 in the morning, covered in blood, but somehow peaceful, holding a kitchen knife in her lap as if it was the most natural thing in the world. It was a reminder that sometimes reality is far more disturbing than anything our imagination could create, and that the most haunting encounters are often with people whose stories we'll never fully understand. The case of Janet Morrison became a tragic example of how domestic violence can escalate to homicide, and how the aftermath of such violence can affect not just the immediate families involved, but entire neighborhoods and communities. The fact that a traumatized woman covered in blood could spend hours sitting peacefully on a stranger's porch, visible to anyone who happened to look outside, became a reminder that tragedy and violence exist alongside our ordinary lives, separated from us by nothing more than luck and circumstance. For Tommy Hendricks, the woman in white represented a loss of innocence, the moment when he learned that the world contained real dangers that were far more frightening than any monster hiding under his bed. It was the night when a child's observation, initially dismissed as imagination, turned out to be a crucial witness account of someone else's tragedy, someone else's moment of crisis that had spilled over into his family's peaceful suburban life. The story serves as a reminder that we should listen carefully when children report seeing things that seem impossible or frightening, because sometimes their eyes are the clearest witnesses to realities that adults prefer not to acknowledge. Sometimes the most disturbing encounters are not with supernatural beings, but with real people whose lives have taken them to places so dark that they seem otherworldly to those of us who have been fortunate enough never to experience such depths of despair and violence. Let's move to our 8th story, and this one will make you question everything you think you know about your neighbors and what might be happening right beneath your feet. This is about a family who discovered that the pleasant suburban neighborhood they thought they knew was hiding something so disturbing, so elaborately planned, that it defied all logic and challenged everything they believed about the safety of their own home. What makes this story particularly terrifying is how long the threat existed undetected, how close it came to destroying an entire family, and how the truth was hidden in plain sight for years. This story takes place in a quiet residential neighborhood in suburban Ohio during the early 2000s, the kind of place where families move to escape the dangers of city life, where children ride bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors know each other's names. The Patterson family, David, Linda, and their 2 children, 12-year-old Sarah and 8-year-old Michael, had lived in their modest ranch house for about 7 years, long enough to feel completely settled and secure in their community. Their next-door neighbor was a man named Robert Kellerman, a soft-spoken individual in his 50s who lived alone in a house that was identical to theirs, except for the meticulously maintained garden that he spent hours tending every weekend. Robert was the kind of neighbor that everyone appreciated. Quiet, helpful when needed, and respectful of property boundaries. He would wave from his garden when the Patterson children played in their backyard, occasionally help David with minor home repairs, and seemed to be exactly the type of stable, harmless neighbor that families hope for when they move to suburban communities. The first sign that something was wrong came in the form of strange sounds that Linda Patterson began hearing late at night. Initially, she attributed these sounds to the normal settling of houses, or perhaps to the work that Robert occasionally did in his basement workshop. The sounds were rhythmic and methodical, a soft tapping or scraping that seemed to come from underground, sometimes lasting for hours during the early morning darkness between midnight and 4 a.m. Linda mentioned the sounds to David, who investigated by walking around their property and listening carefully. But he could never pinpoint the source or even confirm that he was hearing the same things Linda described. The sounds seemed to be coming from beneath their house, but their basement showed no signs of disturbance, no evidence of any kind of work or activity that would explain the noises Linda was hearing night after night. Over several months, the sounds became more frequent and more distinct. Linda began to notice patterns. The sounds would start around midnight and continue until sometime before dawn. They seemed to be moving in a consistent direction beneath their house. And they had the quality of deliberate work rather than random settling or natural causes. She started keeping a journal of when she heard the sounds, trying to document patterns that might help explain what was happening. Sarah Patterson, who was 12 and had recently moved from a childhood bedroom to a basement bedroom as part of claiming more independence and space, began reporting strange experiences of her own. She complained that her bedroom felt cold even when the rest of the house was comfortable, that she sometimes heard voices talking quietly somewhere nearby, but couldn't identify the source, and that she had the persistent feeling that someone was watching her even when she was alone in her room. David and Linda initially attributed Sarah's reports to the normal adjustment of sleeping in a new room, particularly one that was below ground level and naturally felt different from upstairs bedrooms. Basement bedrooms often felt cooler and had different acoustics, and they assumed that Sarah was simply getting used to the new environment and perhaps letting her imagination amplify normal household sounds. But Sarah's reports became more specific and more disturbing. She claimed that she could hear people talking about her family by name, that the voices knew details about their daily routines and activities, and that sometimes the conversations included discussion of plans or intentions that made her feel unsafe. Sarah also reported seeing small holes in her bedroom walls that she was certain hadn't been there when she first moved into the room. Holes that seemed to have been carefully drilled and then partially concealed. The breaking point came on a February night when Linda was awakened by what she initially thought was Sarah screaming. Linda rushed downstairs to Sarah's bedroom and found her daughter huddled in her bed, terrified and pointing at the wall near her dresser. Sarah was convinced that someone had been watching her through a hole in the wall, that she had seen an eye looking into her room from somewhere behind the drywall. David examined the wall that Sarah was pointing to and discovered something that made his blood run cold. There was indeed a small hole in the wall, about the size of a pencil, that had been carefully drilled through the drywall and seemed to extend beyond the wall into some kind of empty space behind it. The hole was positioned at exactly the right height and angle to provide a view of Sarah's bed, and it had been concealed with a small piece of paint-colored putty that could be easily removed and replaced. David immediately called the police, but the responding officers were initially skeptical that a small hole in a basement wall represented a serious threat. However, the officer who examined the hole more carefully realized that it suggested something far more sinister than a simple peeping Tom incident. The hole appeared to extend beyond the foundation wall of the Patterson house, which meant that someone had created a viewing portal from some kind of space that existed outside their home's basement, but still underground. The police investigation that followed revealed one of the most elaborate and disturbing criminal operations that law enforcement in that area had ever encountered. Robert Kellerman, the quiet, helpful neighbor that the Patterson family had trusted for 7 years, had spent those years constructing an underground tunnel system that connected his basement to multiple neighboring houses, including the Patterson home. The tunnel system was not a crude or hastily constructed set of passages, but an elaborate underground network that had been planned and built with considerable engineering skill and attention to detail. The tunnels were tall enough for an adult to walk through comfortably, had been reinforced with wooden supports to prevent collapse, and included electrical lighting powered by an illegal tap into the neighborhood's electrical grid. The entire system represented years of careful, methodical work that had gone completely undetected by anyone in the neighborhood. But the tunnels were just the beginning of what investigators discovered. At the center of Robert's underground network was a room that he had excavated beneath his own house, a space that was larger than most bedrooms and had been finished with the same attention to detail as any above-ground living space. The room contained furniture, lighting, and what could only be described as a shrine dedicated to monitoring and stalking the families in the neighborhood. The walls of this underground room were covered with photographs of the Patterson family and several other neighboring families. These weren't casual photos taken from a distance, but intimate images that had clearly been captured through windows during private family moments, in their own backyards and inside their homes. Some of the photographs showed the family sleeping, some showed them in various states of undress, and some showed the children playing in ways that revealed a deeply disturbing focus on the younger family members. But the photographs were just one aspect of the shrine that Robert had created. The room also contained detailed written logs of each family's daily routines, work schedules, school activities, and personal habits. Robert had documented when each family member left the house and returned, what television shows they watched, what foods they ate, and what conversations they had in the privacy of their own homes. The level of surveillance was so comprehensive that Robert knew more about the Patterson family's daily life than they knew about it themselves. The investigation revealed that Robert had been using the tunnel system to access multiple homes in the neighborhood, not just for surveillance, but for more invasive activities. He had been entering houses when families were away, going through personal belongings, taking small items that wouldn't be missed, and apparently living out fantasies of control and possession that had been building for years. The Patterson family discovered that food had been disappearing from their kitchen, that Sarah's clothing had been disturbed in ways they had attributed to normal teenage messiness, and that family photographs had been stolen and replaced with copies. The most terrifying discovery was a detailed plan that investigators found in Robert's underground shrine, a plan that outlined his intentions to eventually kidnap Sarah Patterson and keep her in a specially prepared section of his tunnel system. The plan included diagrams of restraints he had purchased, schedules for when the kidnapping would be most feasible, and even contingency plans for dealing with her family's response to her disappearance. Robert had been preparing for months to take Sarah, and the plan was sophisticated enough that it might very well have succeeded. The timeline that investigators reconstructed showed that Robert had been planning his attack for the night of Sarah's 13th birthday, which was still several weeks away when his activities were discovered. He had apparently been waiting for some psychological significance attached to her reaching that particular age. And his surveillance had become more intensive as the date approached. The Patterson family realized that they had unknowingly been living on borrowed time, that their daughter had been just weeks away from becoming the victim of an elaborate kidnapping plot that had been years in the making. The psychological impact on the Patterson family was devastating and long-lasting. They learned that their home, which they had thought of as their safe refuge from the world, had been completely compromised for years. Their most private moments had been observed and documented. Their children had been stalked and photographed without their knowledge. And their family routines had been studied by a predator who was planning to destroy their lives. Sarah, who had been the primary target of Robert's obsession, struggled with the knowledge that her instincts about being watched had been correct, that her fears about voices and holes in the walls had been real rather than imaginary. The realization that an adult neighbor had been planning to kidnap her, that her own bedroom had been under surveillance, and that her family's entire life had been invaded, created trauma that required years of therapy to address. David and Linda had to grapple with the fact that they had failed to protect their children from a threat that had been operating literally beneath their feet for years. The sounds that Linda had been hearing, the cold spots that Sarah had complained about, the feeling of being watched. All of these warning signs had been real, but they had been dismissed or rationalized away because the truth was too horrible to consider. The investigation into Robert Kellerman revealed that he had no prior criminal record, no history of mental health treatment, and no obvious warning signs that would have alerted anyone to his dangerous obsessions. He had been employed as an engineer, which explained his ability to design and construct the elaborate tunnel system. And he had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade without any complaints or incidents that would have raised suspicions about his activities. Robert's motivation for his elaborate stalking and kidnapping plan was never fully understood, even after extensive psychological evaluation. He showed signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and what psychologists described as an extreme need for control over other people's lives. His underground shrine seemed to represent a fantasy world where he could observe and control his neighbors without their knowledge, where he could possess intimate details about their lives while remaining completely unknown to them. The tunnel system that Robert had created was so extensive that it took investigators weeks to map all of its passages and connections. In addition to the Patterson house, the tunnels connected to 4 other homes in the neighborhood, and each of those families discovered that they too had been under surveillance for years. The entire neighborhood had been compromised by one man's elaborate fantasy of control and possession, and multiple families had to come to terms with the fact that their most private moments had been observed and documented. The legal case against Robert Kellerman resulted in convictions on multiple charges, including stalking, burglary, attempted kidnapping, illegal surveillance, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, though many community members felt that even that punishment was inadequate for the psychological damage he had inflicted on multiple families and the elaborate nature of his criminal enterprise. The Patterson family moved out of their home within months of Robert's arrest, unable to continue living in a place that had been so completely violated. They had the house thoroughly inspected and all of the tunnel access points sealed. But the knowledge that their home had been infiltrated for years made it impossible for them to feel safe there. Other families in the neighborhood also moved, and the community never fully recovered from the revelation that such an elaborate criminal operation had been conducted undetected for so long. The case became a subject of study for law enforcement agencies, criminologists, and security experts, trying to understand how such an elaborate stalking operation could be conducted without detection. The fact that Robert had been able to excavate and construct an extensive underground tunnel system while maintaining the appearance of a normal, quiet neighbor challenged assumptions about how criminal behavior manifests and how communities can protect themselves from hidden threats. For the Patterson family, the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of safety, privacy, and the trustworthiness of appearances. They learned that predators can hide behind facades of normalcy for years while planning elaborate attacks. That family homes can be compromised in ways that are impossible to detect without specific knowledge and investigation. And that children's reports of feeling unsafe or being watched should always be taken seriously, even when they seem impossible or irrational. The underground shrine that Robert had created represents one of the most disturbing examples of long-term stalking and surveillance that law enforcement has ever encountered. The combination of technical skill, psychological obsession, and elaborate planning that went into his criminal enterprise serves as a reminder that some threats to family safety are far more sophisticated and persistent than most people ever imagine. The story of the Patterson family and their neighbors' underground network of tunnels and surveillance equipment became a cautionary tale about the importance of trusting instincts, taking children's safety concerns seriously, and recognizing that the greatest dangers sometimes come not from strangers, but from people who have spent years earning trust while secretly planning betrayal. The case stands as proof that evil can hide in the most ordinary places, that safety is more fragile than we want to believe, and that some people are capable of levels of deception and planning that defy all reasonable expectations about human behavior. Today, the houses in that Ohio neighborhood sit on ground that was once honeycombed with tunnels dug by a man whose obsessions turned an entire community into his personal hunting ground. The tunnels have been filled in, the shrine has been destroyed, and Robert Kellerman will never again threaten any family. But the psychological scars remain, and the knowledge that such elaborate evil can exist hidden beneath our feet serves as a permanent reminder that our sense of safety and security is often based on assumptions about the world that can be shattered by the revelation of what some people are capable of planning and executing in the darkness beneath our homes. Let's move to our 9th story, and this one will make you question everything you think you know about technology, death, and the possibility that our digital lives might somehow continue even after our physical lives end. This is about a widower who discovered that his deceased wife's smartphone was somehow still active 2 years after her death, still connected to their shared digital world in ways that defied every technical explanation and challenged his understanding of what happens to our electronic existence when we die. Meet David Chen, a 42-year-old software engineer living in Portland, Oregon, who had been married to his wife Maria for 15 years before she died in a car accident in March 2019. Maria had been the center of David's world. They had met in college, built a life together filled with shared interests in technology, travel, and their small circle of close friends. Maria was a graphic designer who was as comfortable with digital technology as David was, and their home was filled with the usual collection of smartphones, tablets, smart speakers, and connected devices that define modern life. When Maria died, one of the most difficult tasks David faced was dealing with her digital presence. Maria's iPhone, which had been destroyed in the car accident, contained years of photos, messages, and memories that David desperately wanted to preserve. He had immediately contacted Apple to see if there was any way to recover data from the damaged device. But the phone had been so completely destroyed that even professional data recovery services couldn't extract anything from it. The physical device was a twisted piece of metal and glass, and all of Maria's digital life seemed to have been lost along with her physical life. David went through the standard process of closing Maria's digital accounts, canceling her phone service, deactivating her social media profiles, and removing her access to shared accounts and services. It was a painful but necessary part of grieving, like cleaning out her closet or canceling her magazine subscriptions. The process felt final, like he was systematically erasing the last traces of Maria's presence in the digital world they had shared. For 2 years after Maria's death, David slowly rebuilt his life as a single person. He kept their house, maintained friendships they had shared, and found ways to honor Maria's memory without being consumed by grief. He had Maria's destroyed iPhone in a box in his closet, along with other personal items from the accident. But he never looked at it because it was too painful, and because there was nothing left of the device that could possibly function. The first strange incident occurred on a Tuesday night in January 2021, almost 2 years after Maria's death. David was working late in his home office when his own iPhone received a Bluetooth pairing request from a device identified as Maria's iPhone. David stared at the notification for several minutes, convinced that he was seeing things or that his phone was malfunctioning. Maria's iPhone had been destroyed in the accident, had never been replaced, and even if it had somehow survived, the cellular service had been canceled years ago. David dismissed the Bluetooth notification as some kind of technical glitch, probably caused by a neighbor's device that happened to have a similar name, or by some kind of interference from other electronic equipment in his house. He was a software engineer who understood how technology worked, and he knew that Bluetooth pairing requests from destroyed devices were impossible. There had to be a logical explanation that didn't involve supernatural activity or impossible technology. But the Bluetooth requests continued. Over the next several weeks, David's phone would randomly receive pairing requests from Maria's iPhone, always late at night, always when David was alone in the house. The requests would appear on his screen for a few seconds and then disappear, as if someone was trying to connect to his phone, but then changing their mind or losing the signal. David tried everything he could think of to explain the phenomenon. He checked with neighbors to see if anyone had a device named similarly to Maria's phone. He researched whether old Bluetooth connections could somehow persist in his phone's memory and create false pairing requests. He even contacted Apple's technical support to ask if there was any way that a destroyed device could continue broadcasting Bluetooth signals. But the support representatives assured him that what he was describing was technically impossible. The situation escalated dramatically on the night of March 15th, 2021, exactly 2 years after Maria's death. David was lying in bed, unable to sleep because the anniversary of the accident always brought back painful memories, when his phone buzzed with not just a Bluetooth pairing request, but an actual incoming call from Maria's iPhone. The caller ID showed Maria's name and the phone number that had been disconnected for 2 years, and the call was ringing through his phone's speakers as if it was completely normal. David's hands were shaking as he stared at his phone's screen, watching it ring with a call from his dead wife's destroyed phone. Every rational part of his mind told him that this was impossible, that there had to be some technical explanation, or that he was experiencing some kind of psychological break brought on by the anniversary of Maria's death. But the call was real, his phone was ringing, and the caller ID clearly showed information from Maria's old phone. After letting it ring for nearly a minute, David answered the call. There was silence on the other end, but not the dead silence of a disconnected line. It was the kind of quiet that suggests someone is there, listening, breathing softly. David whispered, "Maria?" into the phone, feeling foolish, but unable to stop himself from hoping that somehow, impossibly, his wife was trying to communicate with him from wherever she had gone. The call lasted for exactly 3 minutes and 27 seconds before disconnecting. And during that entire time, David could hear what sounded like soft breathing or sighing, but no words, no clear sounds that would indicate who or what was on the other end of the line. When the call ended, David immediately tried calling the number back, but he received an automated message stating that the number was not in service, which had been the case for 2 years. David spent the rest of the night researching everything he could find about phone numbers being reactivated, about cellular networks maintaining connections to destroyed devices, about any technical possibility that could explain what was happening. But everything he found confirmed what he already knew as a technology professional. What he was experiencing was impossible according to every known principle of how cellular networks and smartphones operate. The calls continued sporadically over the next several months, always from Maria's iPhone, always late at night when David was alone. Sometimes the calls would last just a few seconds, sometimes several minutes, but they always consisted of the same mysterious silence that suggested someone was there without providing any clear communication. David began keeping a log of the calls, documenting the time, duration, and any sounds he could detect, hoping to find some pattern that might explain what was happening. The most disturbing call occurred on a Thursday night in June, when David answered the phone and clearly heard what sounded like Maria's voice whispering his name. It was faint and unclear, as if coming from a great distance or through significant interference. But David was certain that he heard Maria say "David" twice before the call disconnected. The sound of her voice, even filtered through whatever impossible technology was making these calls possible, brought back a flood of memories and emotions that David had spent 2 years learning to manage. David became obsessed with understanding what was happening to him. He consulted with other software engineers, reached out to telecommunications experts, and even contacted paranormal investigators who claimed to specialize in electronic voice phenomena. The technical experts all assured him that what he was describing was impossible, while the paranormal investigators were excited by his story but couldn't provide any scientific explanation for the calls. The breakthrough came when David decided to examine Maria's destroyed iPhone more carefully. He had kept the device in a box since the accident, never looking at it because it was too painful and because he assumed it was completely non-functional. But driven by his need to understand the impossible calls, David finally opened the box and examined the remains of Maria's phone. What he found was exactly what he expected: a device that had been completely destroyed in the car accident, with a shattered screen, bent frame, and internal components that were obviously non-functional. But as David was handling the broken device, something extraordinary happened. His own iPhone received another Bluetooth pairing request from Maria's iPhone. And this time, David was holding both devices and could see that the destroyed phone had somehow briefly activated, with a faint glow visible through cracks in the broken screen. David watched in amazement as the destroyed device seemed to struggle to life for a few seconds, its broken display flickering with fragments of the familiar iOS interface, before dying again and returning to its non-functional state. But during those few seconds of impossible activity, David's phone had detected the destroyed device's Bluetooth signal and received the pairing request that had been mystifying him for months. Over the next several weeks, David began to understand that Maria's phone was somehow activating sporadically, drawing power from an unknown source and briefly connecting to cellular and Bluetooth networks before dying again. The activations seemed to be triggered by David's emotional state, occurring most frequently when he was feeling particularly sad or lonely, as if the device was somehow responding to his need for connection with Maria. David started experimenting with the phenomenon, placing the destroyed phone near his own device during times when he was missing Maria most intensely. He discovered that the broken phone would sometimes respond to his emotional distress by briefly activating, sending Bluetooth signals, or even making calls to his phone. The device seemed to be operating on some kind of residual energy or connection that defied every principle of electronics and physics that David understood. The most extraordinary incident occurred on Maria's birthday in September, when David was sitting in their bedroom holding both phones and talking to the broken device as if Maria could hear him. as he was telling the destroyed phone about his day, about how much he missed her, about the life they had planned together that would never happen. The device suddenly activated with more stability than it had ever shown before. For nearly 10 minutes, the broken phone maintained enough functionality to display fragments of Maria's photos, to play seconds of songs from her music library, and to show pieces of text messages they had exchanged years earlier. David watched in amazement as his wife's digital life briefly returned from the grave, as if the phone was using its last possible moment of function to remind him of their shared memories and the love they had experienced together. During that 10-minute window, David was able to recover several photos that he thought had been lost forever. Images of their last vacation together that had only been stored on Maria's phone. The device somehow managed to transfer these photos to David's phone via airdrop, giving him precious memories that he had assumed were gone forever. When the transfer was complete, Maria's phone finally died completely, never to activate again. The final manifestation of the impossible technology occurred exactly 1 year after the first Bluetooth pairing request. David received one last call from Maria's iPhone, but this time, instead of mysterious silence, he heard a clear recording of Maria's voice saying, "I love you, David. Let me go." It was unmistakably her voice, speaking words that she had never recorded, delivered through a phone that had been destroyed for nearly 3 years. After that final call, the phenomenon ended completely. David never again received Bluetooth pairing requests from Maria's phone, never again got calls from her disconnected number, and the destroyed device never again showed any signs of impossible activation. It was as if Maria's digital presence had used its last possible energy to communicate one final message of love and closure before finally allowing David to move forward with his life. David eventually met someone new, a woman who understood his loss and respected his memories of Maria. When he told her about the impossible phone calls and the destroyed device that had somehow continued communicating for 2 years after Maria's death, she listened without judgment and acknowledged that love sometimes manifests in ways that science cannot explain. The destroyed iPhone now sits in a place of honor in David's home, no longer a source of mysterious communication, but a reminder that the bonds between people who love each other might be stronger than the physical limitations of life and death. David never found a technical explanation for what happened, never discovered how a destroyed device could have continued functioning for years after its destruction, never understood how Maria's digital presence had persisted long after her physical death. But the experience taught David that our connections to the people we love might extend beyond the boundaries of technology, that the digital traces we leave behind might somehow carry forward the essence of who we were, and that sometimes the most advanced technology in the world is no match for the power of human love and the need for connection that transcends even death itself. The case remains a mystery that challenges our understanding of technology, consciousness, and the possibility that our digital selves might somehow persist in ways that we don't yet understand. For David, the impossible phone calls were not a source of fear, but a gift, a final opportunity to feel connected to the woman he had loved, a reminder that some bonds cannot be broken by death, and a demonstration that love might be the most powerful force in both the physical and digital worlds. David's story serves as a reminder that in our increasingly connected world, the relationship between technology and human consciousness might be more complex than we realize, that our digital lives might have a persistence and autonomy that science has yet to explain, and that sometimes the most impossible things are also the most real when they involve the enduring power of love between two people who refuse to let death have the final word. Let's move to our 10th story, and this one will leave you questioning everything you think you know about disappearances, evidence, and the thin line between hope and horror. This is about three women who vanished from a Texas shopping center during what should have been a routine Christmas shopping trip, leaving behind evidence so puzzling and contradictory that investigators still can't explain what happened to them more than 2 decades later. What makes this case particularly disturbing is how the physical evidence suggests the women made it safely back to their car, purchased their intended gifts, and then simply ceased to exist. This story takes place in Fort Worth, Texas, on December 23, 1974, just 2 days before Christmas. Three women, Rachel Tice, 47, her daughter Lisa Wilson, 24, and Lisa's friend Julianne Mosley, 25, had planned a last-minute shopping trip to the Seminary South Shopping Center to pick up final Christmas gifts for their families. It was supposed to be a quick, efficient trip, the kind of pre-holiday errand that millions of people complete without incident every year. The women were experienced shoppers who knew the mall well, had specific items they needed to purchase, and expected to be home by early evening to continue their Christmas preparations. Rachel Tice was a responsible mother and grandmother who had never been involved in any kind of dangerous or risky behavior. She was married to a Fort Worth police officer, which made her naturally cautious about personal safety and aware of potential dangers that other people might overlook. Lisa Wilson was Rachel's oldest daughter, a married woman with 2 young children who worked as a secretary and was known for her reliability and punctuality. Julianne Mosley was Lisa's best friend since high school, a single woman who worked as a bank teller and was considered by everyone who knew her to be sensible, trustworthy, and completely dependable. The three women left Rachel's house around 6 p.m. on December 23rd, driving together in Rachel's light blue 1974 Oldsmobile sedan. Their plan was straightforward: drive to Seminary South Shopping Center, split up to make their individual purchases more efficiently, meet back at the car by 9 p.m., and return home in time for the late-night Christmas preparations that families traditionally do on December 23rd. They had a specific list of items to buy, knew exactly which stores they needed to visit, and had enough cash and credit to make their purchases without any complications. The Seminary South Shopping Center was one of Fort Worth's busiest retail locations, especially during the Christmas season. On December 23rd, the parking lot was packed with last-minute shoppers. The stores were crowded with people making final purchases, and the atmosphere was typical of the controlled chaos that characterizes American shopping centers during the final days before Christmas. Security was heightened because of the holiday, crowds with both mall security guards and additional police patrols keeping watch over the busy shopping complex. The last confirmed sighting of the three women was at approximately 8:15 p.m., when a mall security guard noticed them walking together near the main entrance of the shopping center. The guard later told investigators that the women seemed relaxed and happy, carrying shopping bags and engaged in animated conversation about their purchases. They appeared to be heading toward the parking lot, presumably to return to their car and conclude their shopping trip successfully. When the women failed to return home by 10 p.m., their families began calling each other to see if there had been any change of plans or delays. Rachel's husband, police officer James Tice, was initially not concerned because holiday shopping often took longer than expected, and he knew that the three women enjoyed each other's company and might have decided to extend their evening with dinner or additional shopping. But when 11 p.m. passed without any contact from the women, Officer Tice's professional instincts began to override his personal optimism. By midnight, when there was still no word from Rachel, Lisa, or Julianne, Officer Tice contacted the Fort Worth Police Department and reported the three women as missing. Because of his law enforcement background and his knowledge of the women's reliable character, the missing persons report was taken seriously immediately, rather than being dismissed as adults who might have simply changed their plans without notifying anyone. The initial search of the Seminary South Shopping Center parking lot yielded a discovery that made the case immediately puzzling and disturbing. Rachel's 1974 Oldsmobile was found in the same parking area where she had left it, apparently undisturbed and showing no signs of forced entry, theft, or struggle. The car was properly locked, the keys were missing, and everything appeared to be exactly as the women would have left it if they had completed their shopping trip successfully. But here's where the case becomes truly mystifying. Inside the car, investigators found multiple shopping bags containing Christmas gifts that the women had obviously purchased during their evening at the mall. The bags contained presents that matched the items the women had told their families they intended to buy. The receipts showed purchase times throughout the evening culminating around 8:30 p.m. And everything suggested that the women had completed their shopping successfully and had returned to their car to load their purchases. The evidence inside the car painted a picture of a successful shopping trip that had concluded exactly as planned. There were gifts for Rachel's grandchildren, items that Lisa had been looking for her husband, and presents that Julie Ann had mentioned wanting to buy for her parents. The receipts showed that the women had visited multiple stores, had made their planned purchases efficiently, and had been together as late as 8:30 p.m. when the final receipt was time-stamped. But if the women had made it back to their car, had loaded their shopping bags, and had presumably prepared to drive home, what had happened to them next? The car showed no signs of struggle, no evidence that anyone had been forced to leave against their will, no indication of violence or coercion. The shopping bags were neatly arranged in the back seat, the car was properly locked, and everything suggested a normal conclusion to a routine shopping trip. The mystery deepened when investigators discovered additional evidence that seemed to support the theory that the women had intended to return home normally. Rachel's purse was missing from the car, which would be expected if she had taken it with her when leaving the vehicle. But Lisa's and Julie Ann's purses were found in the car, neatly placed under the front seats as if they had been deliberately hidden for security reasons. Exactly the kind of precaution that careful shoppers might take in a crowded parking lot. The most puzzling piece of evidence was a handwritten note found on the dashboard of Rachel's car. The note, written in what appeared to be Rachel's handwriting, said, "We have decided to go to Houston for a few days. We'll call when we get back. Don't worry." The note was signed with Rachel's name and dated December 23rd. But everything about it seemed wrong to the families who knew these women well. Rachel had never mentioned any plans to go to Houston, had no friends or relatives there that would explain a spontaneous trip, and had never in her life left town without making detailed arrangements for her family and responsibilities. Lisa had young children at home who were expecting her to be there on Christmas morning, and she would never have abandoned them during the most important family holiday of the year. Julie Ann had to work on December 26th and had never called in sick or failed to show up for her job responsibilities. Moreover, the timing of a spontaneous trip to Houston made no sense. December 23rd was not a time when responsible mothers and grandmothers suddenly decided to leave town for a few days, abandoning their Christmas preparations and leaving their families to wonder what had happened to them. The note seemed like an obvious attempt to buy time or misdirect the investigation, but it was written in handwriting that appeared to match Rachel's writing style. The investigation that followed was extensive and thorough, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and hundreds of hours of detective work. Investigators interviewed every store employee who had worked at Seminary South Shopping Center on December 23rd, reviewed security footage from multiple locations, and followed up on every possible lead or sighting that was reported by the public. The shopping center's security cameras from 1974 were limited compared to modern surveillance systems, but they did capture some footage of the three women during their shopping trip. The videos showed them entering various stores, making purchases, and walking through the mall corridors carrying shopping bags. The final piece of security footage showed the women walking toward the parking lot around 8:20 p.m., apparently concluding their shopping trip successfully. But no security cameras covered the specific area of the parking lot where Rachel's car was found, so there was no visual record of what happened to the women after they left the mall's interior. The gap in surveillance coverage meant that the critical moments when the women disappeared were not documented by any recording devices, leaving investigators with no visual evidence of what had occurred. The search for the three women expanded throughout Texas and into neighboring states, with particular focus on Houston because of the note found in Rachel's car. But despite extensive searches, media coverage, and public appeals for information, no trace of Rachel Tice, Lisa Wilson, or Julianne Mosley was ever found. They had simply vanished completely, leaving behind only their successfully completed Christmas shopping and a suspicious note that seemed designed to discourage immediate investigation. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed to explain what happened to the three women. Some investigators believed that they were victims of foul play, possibly kidnapped by someone who forced Rachel to write the misleading note before disposing of all three women in a way that prevented their bodies from ever being discovered. The fact that experienced criminals might know that a note claiming the women had left voluntarily would delay serious investigation for several crucial days made this theory plausible. Other investigators theorized that the women might have witnessed a crime in progress, seen something they shouldn't have seen, and been eliminated by people who couldn't risk having witnesses to their activities. The busy Christmas shopping environment would have provided cover for criminal activities, and the women's disappearance might have been a desperate attempt to silence potential witnesses to a more serious crime. A more disturbing theory suggested that the women might have been selected as targets by organized criminals who specialized in kidnapping and human trafficking. The 1970s were a time when such crimes were less well understood and less effectively investigated than they are today. And three women traveling together might have represented valuable targets for people involved in such activities. The most puzzling aspect of the case remains the evidence suggesting that the women completed their shopping trip successfully and made it back to their car safely. The shopping bags, the receipts, the locked car, and the hidden purses all suggest that whatever happened to them occurred after they had concluded their mall visit and were presumably preparing to drive home. This timing makes the disappearance particularly mysterious because it suggests that the women were taken from a location where they should have been safest, their own vehicle in a busy parking lot. The families of Rachel Tice, Lisa Wilson, and Julianne Mosley never gave up hope that the women might someday be found, or that the mystery of their disappearance might be solved. Officer James Tice continued investigating his wife's disappearance until his own death years later, never accepting that she had voluntarily left her family and never believing that the note found in the car represented her genuine intentions. The case remains officially open with the Fort Worth Police Department, though active investigation has been minimal in recent years due to the lack of new leads or evidence. The disappearance of the three women has become part of Texas folklore, a reminder that even in busy, public places, people can vanish without explanation and leave behind mysteries that defy all attempts at logical solution. The Christmas gifts that the women purchased on their final shopping trip were eventually distributed to their intended recipients. But the joy of those presents was forever shadowed by the knowledge that the women who bought them with such care and love had somehow ceased to exist just moments after completing their purchases. The image of three women successfully finishing their Christmas shopping, loading their car with gifts for their families, and then simply disappearing into the darkness remains one of the most haunting, unsolved mysteries in Texas criminal history. The Seminary South Shopping Center continued operating for many years after the disappearance, but employees and shoppers alike were always aware of the three women who had vanished from its parking lot on December 23, 1974. The case served as a reminder that danger can strike anywhere, at any time, even during the most routine and innocent activities. Today, more than 45 years after their disappearance, Rachel Tice, Lisa Wilson, and Julie Ann Mosley remain missing, their fate unknown. Their families still wondering what happened during those final moments in the shopping center parking lot. Their story stands as one of the most perplexing disappearance cases in American criminal history. A mystery that challenges our understanding of how three people can simply cease to exist, while leaving behind evidence that suggests everything was proceeding normally until the moment they vanished forever. The case reminds us that some mysteries may never be solved, that some questions about human fate and criminal behavior may remain unanswered despite the best efforts of law enforcement, and the desperate need of families for closure and understanding. The three women who went Christmas shopping and never came home represent all the missing persons whose stories remain untold, whose disappearances remain unexplained, and whose families continue waiting for answers that may never come. Their story serves as a chilling reminder that ordinary activities like Christmas shopping can suddenly transform into inexplicable tragedies, that the safety we feel in familiar places may be more fragile than we realize, and that sometimes the most disturbing mysteries are those where all the evidence suggests that everything should have ended normally, but instead, three people simply walked out of existence and into a mystery that continues to haunt everyone who learns their story. Let's move to our 11th story. And this final tale will leave you checking every camera in your home and questioning whether the technology meant to protect us might sometimes become the very thing we need protection from. This is about a homeowner whose security system became compromised by someone who transformed surveillance equipment from a shield into a weapon, using the very devices meant to provide safety as tools for psychological torture and invasion. What makes this story the most disturbing of all is how it reveals that our most intimate spaces can be violated by people we've never met, who can watch our most private moments and use that knowledge to destroy our sense of safety in our own homes. This story takes place in suburban Phoenix, Arizona, and involves a woman named Jennifer Martinez, a 31-year-old nurse who lived alone in a modest, single-story house that she had purchased 2 years earlier. Jennifer was the kind of person who took security seriously, having worked night shifts at the hospital where she had seen firsthand the aftermath of home invasions, stalking cases, and domestic violence. When she bought her house, one of her first investments was a comprehensive home security system with multiple cameras, motion sensors, and smartphone connectivity that allowed her to monitor her property remotely. The security system that Jennifer installed was state-of-the-art for 2018, featuring 6 high-definition cameras positioned around her property, 2 covering the front yard and driveway, 2 monitoring the backyard and patio area, 1 watching the side entrance, and 1 positioned inside the house near the front door. The system was connected to her home Wi-Fi network and allowed her to view live feeds from her smartphone, receive motion alerts, and review recorded footage from anywhere in the world. For Jennifer, who often worked late shifts and came home to an empty house in the early morning hours, the security system provided crucial peace of mind. For the first year after installation, the security system functioned exactly as intended. Jennifer would receive normal motion alerts when delivery trucks arrived, when neighborhood cats wandered through her yard, and when weather conditions triggered the sensitive motion detectors. She occasionally reviewed the recorded footage when she wanted to check on specific incidents, and the system provided exactly the kind of security monitoring she had wanted when she made the investment. The first sign that something was wrong came in October 2019, when Jennifer began noticing that her security system's motion alerts were becoming more frequent and occurring at unusual times. She would receive notifications at 3:33 a.m. almost every night, always showing movement in different areas around her house. But when she checked the live feeds from her phone, she could never see anything that would have triggered the alerts. The recorded footage from these incidents showed normal nighttime, scenes with no visible movement, making Jennifer assume that the system was experiencing technical glitches or false alarms caused by changes in lighting or small animals. Initially, Jennifer contacted the security company's technical support to report the frequent false alarms. The technicians ran remote diagnostics on her system and found no hardware malfunctions or software errors that would explain the excessive alerts. They suggested that the motion sensors might be too sensitive for her environment and offered to adjust the sensitivity settings. But even after these adjustments, the 3:33 a.m. alerts continued with disturbing regularity. What Jennifer didn't realize was that her security system had been compromised by a sophisticated hacker who had gained access to her cameras and motion sensors through vulnerabilities in the system's internet connectivity. The person who had infiltrated her security network was not a random cybercriminal looking for financial information or a teenage prankster testing his technical skills. This was someone with a specific, personal interest in Jennifer herself. Someone who had been studying her routines, her habits, and her vulnerabilities for months. The hacker had been using Jennifer's own security cameras to watch her daily life, learning her work schedule, her sleeping patterns, her social activities, and her personal routines. He knew when she left for work, when she came home, when she showered, when she cooked dinner, and when she went to bed. The 3:33 a.m. motion alerts were not technical malfunctions, but deliberate signals. A way for the hacker to test whether Jennifer was paying attention to her security system and to gauge how she responded to unusual activity. The psychological torture began subtly in December 2019, when Jennifer started hearing her own voice coming from the security system's speakers. She would be lying in bed late at night when she would hear fragments of conversations she had recorded earlier that day, played back through the indoor camera's audio system at low volume. At first, Jennifer thought she was hearing echoes or audio feedback from the system, but gradually she realized that someone was deliberately playing back recordings of her private phone conversations and personal activities. The violations escalated quickly from audio harassment to more invasive psychological manipulation. The hacker began speaking directly to Jennifer through her security system's speakers, addressing her by name and demonstrating intimate knowledge of her personal life. He would comment on her appearance when she was getting dressed, make observations about her work schedule, and reference private conversations she had with friends and family members. The realization that someone had been watching and listening to her most private moments was devastating and terrifying. What made the harassment particularly disturbing was how the hacker used Jennifer's own security footage against her. He would play back recorded clips of her daily activities, showering, sleeping, talking on the phone, eating dinner, while providing commentary that revealed how closely he had been watching her and how much he knew about her personal life. The security system that was supposed to protect her had become a weapon for psychological torture, allowing a stranger to invade her privacy and violate her sense of safety in ways she had never imagined possible. The hacker's knowledge of Jennifer's life extended far beyond what he could have learned from watching her security cameras. He knew her work schedule at the hospital, the names of her co-workers, details about her family members, and information about her financial situation. This suggested that he had been conducting extensive surveillance and research, possibly for months or even years, building a comprehensive profile of her life that went far beyond what any security camera could have captured. The most terrifying aspect of the harassment was how the hacker used his knowledge to demonstrate that he could reach her anywhere, at any time. When Jennifer was at work, she would receive phone calls from unknown numbers, and when she answered, she would hear recordings of her own voice played back to her. When she visited friends or family members, she would receive text messages that included specific details about her location and activities, proving that the surveillance extended beyond her home security system. Jennifer contacted the police, but the cyberstalking laws in 2019 were still relatively new and poorly understood by many law enforcement agencies. The officers who responded to her complaints were sympathetic, but admitted that they had limited experience with this type of high-tech harassment. They took a report and recommended that Jennifer contact the FBI's cybercrime unit. But the investigation process was slow and complex, requiring technical expertise that was not readily available in most police departments. Meanwhile, the psychological torture continued and intensified. The hacker began making specific threats about what he planned to do to Jennifer, describing in detail how he would break into her house, what he would do to her when he found her alone, and how he would make her disappear without anyone knowing what had happened to her. The threats were specific enough to suggest that he had been planning an actual physical attack, using the months of surveillance to prepare for an in-person assault. The turning point came when Jennifer realized that the hacker was not just watching her through her own security system, but had somehow gained access to other cameras and devices in her neighborhood. He began providing real-time commentary on her activities when she was outside her house, describing what she was wearing when she left for work, which route she took to the hospital, and what time she typically returned home. This level of surveillance suggested that he had compromised multiple security systems or had recruited accomplices to help with his stalking activities. Jennifer made the difficult decision to abandon her house and move in with her sister, while law enforcement and cybersecurity experts worked to trace the source of the harassment. She had invested years of savings into her home and had felt proud of creating a safe, secure space for herself. But the violation of her privacy and the ongoing threats made it impossible for her to feel safe there. The hacker had succeeded in driving her from her own home, using nothing more than her own security system and his expertise in manipulating technology. The FBI's investigation eventually traced the harassment to a man named Marcus Webb, a 34-year-old IT specialist who lived more than 200 miles away from Jennifer and had never had any legitimate contact with her. Webb had apparently become obsessed with Jennifer after seeing her profile on a social media platform, and had used his technical skills to research her personal information, identify her home address, and gain access to her security system through vulnerabilities in the manufacturer's software. Webb's digital footprint revealed that he had been conducting similar harassment campaigns against multiple women, using compromised security systems to stalk and terrorize victims across several states. His computer contained thousands of hours of recorded footage from various home security systems, detailed profiles of his victims' personal lives, and evidence of extensive planning for physical attacks that he had been preparing to carry out against several of the women he had been stalking. The investigation revealed that Webb had been exploiting security vulnerabilities in popular home security systems for years, gaining access to cameras and audio systems in hundreds of homes, and using that access to select and target victims for long-term harassment. He had developed sophisticated methods for concealing his digital tracks, making it extremely difficult for law enforcement to trace his activities back to his real identity and location. Webb was eventually arrested and charged with multiple federal crimes, including cyberstalking, computer fraud, invasion of privacy, and making terroristic threats. The evidence against him was overwhelming, including recorded conversations where he had threatened Jennifer and other victims, thousands of hours of illegally obtained surveillance footage, and detailed plans for physical attacks. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, but the psychological damage he had inflicted on his victims was permanent and irreversible. For Jennifer, the experience fundamentally changed her relationship with technology and her understanding of digital privacy. She learned that the devices we install to protect ourselves can become weapons against us when they fall into the wrong hands. that our most private moments can be observed and recorded by strangers who use that intimate knowledge to terrorize us, and that the feeling of safety in our own homes can be destroyed by someone we've never met who decides to make us their target. Jennifer eventually returned to her house, but only after having the entire security system professionally rebuilt, with enhanced cybersecurity protections and working with experts to ensure that her network was properly secured against future intrusions. She also became an advocate for stronger cybersecurity regulations and better protection for victims of technology-enabled stalking, sharing her story to help other people understand the potential risks of connected devices. The case became a landmark example of how home security systems can be turned against their owners, leading to improved security standards in the industry and better training for law enforcement officers who respond to cyberstalking complaints. But for Jennifer and the other victims of Marcus Webb's campaign of digital terror, the knowledge that their most private moments had been observed and used against them created lasting trauma that no amount of improved technology could undo. This final story serves as a stark reminder that in our connected world, the technology we trust to protect us can become the very means by which we are violated and terrorized. The cameras we install to watch for intruders can be turned into the eyes of stalkers. The microphones we use for convenience can become the ears of predators. And the smart devices we rely on for security can become weapons in the hands of people who understand technology better than we do. As we conclude these 11 disturbing true midnight horror stories, remember that knowledge is your first line of defense against the darkness that exists in our world. Subscribe to Verified Fears and hit that notification bell, because staying informed about real dangers is how we protect ourselves and our loved ones from becoming the subjects of the next terrifying true story. Here's my serious advice after sharing these documented horrors with you. Trust your instincts always. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Secure your technology by changing default passwords, updating firmware regularly, and covering cameras when not in use. Never ignore your children when they report feeling unsafe or being watched, because their observations might be more accurate than you want to believe. Vary your routines and stay aware of your surroundings, especially during those vulnerable midnight hours when predators prefer to operate. Most importantly, remember that the greatest protection against the real horrors of this world is community. Stay connected with trusted friends and family, check on your neighbors, and never hesitate to call for help when you need it. The darkness is real, but so is our ability to stand against it when we're informed, prepared, and looking out for one another. Stay safe out there, Verified Fears family. The world is full of both beauty and horror, but knowledge and caution can help ensure you experience more of the former and avoid becoming a victim of the latter. Sweet dreams, if you can manage them after tonight.